It was the last week of September when I decided to take a solo camping trip in northern Idaho. I'd been dealing with a lot of stress at work. Tight deadlines, constant noise, never-ending emails, and I wanted to get away from everything. I picked a spot I found on an old hiking forum. It was deep in the woods near the edge of a small lake called Stewart Lake. Hardly anyone talked about it online. There were no official campsites, no restrooms, no ranger outposts, just backcountry. Sounded perfect. I drove from Coeur d'Alene early on a Wednesday morning. My SUV was packed with everything I'd need. A high-quality tent, my sleeping bag, plenty of food, a stove, a first aid kit, extra batteries, and a power bank for emergencies. I even brought a GPS and a laminated map in case I lost signal. I parked my car off a dirt road about 6 miles from the lake. From there, it was all hiking. The trail wasn't marked, but with the GPS and map, I felt confident. The weather was perfect when I started out. Blue skies, crisp air, and not a sound except for birds and the wind moving through the trees. The first few miles were quiet and uneventful. I crossed a shallow stream using some slippery rocks and climbed a few hills, but overall it was manageable. I didn't see a single person, which was exactly what I wanted. It felt like I was walking deeper into the world, away from all the static noise of regular life. I reached the lake around mid-afternoon. It was beautiful, better than I expected. Surrounded by thick pine forest, the water was dark and still, like glass. The only sounds were the occasional bird and my own footsteps crunching over fallen needles. I found a flat area not far from the water to set up my tent. There were no signs that anyone had camped there in a long time. The ground was soft but dry, and a few large rocks nearby made for good sitting spots. I pitched the tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and unpacked my gear. Then I boiled water for some instant noodles. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. I added layers, lit my small camp stove again to make some tea, and sat by the lake watching the last light disappear. There was no cell signal. I checked just to be sure, but it didn't bother me. That was the point of the trip, to disconnect. I went to sleep early that night, not long after sunset. Inside my tent, it was cold but quiet. I could hear some movement in the forest, branches creaking, leaves rustling, but it was all normal. I told myself not to let my imagination run wild. It was just me and the trees and the animals. Sometime in the night, I woke up. It was still pitch dark. I wasn't sure what time it was, but I felt like I'd only been asleep a few hours. What woke me up wasn't a sound exactly. It was more of a feeling, that odd kind of stillness where your brain starts paying attention before your body does. I stayed very still, listening. First, there was nothing, just the wind. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, careful, and deliberate, not crunching through the forest, but stepping lightly on pine needles. Too light for a deer, too slow and measured for a bear. They were close, maybe 30 feet from the tent. I lay there holding my breath. The steps moved slowly around my tent, like someone circling it. I didn't move. I didn't even reach for my flashlight. I just stayed frozen. The steps stopped after a minute or two, but it felt like forever. I waited. Nothing. I finally worked up the nerve to grab my flashlight and flick it on, shining the beam against the tent walls. Nothing moved. I didn't unzip the flap. I didn't want to let out heat or make noise. I just sat there in silence, flashlight still on, ears wide open. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep. In the morning, the first thing I did was check outside the tent. There were no tracks. The ground was too firm and covered in pine needles for anything clear to show. But I knew I heard something. Couldn't prove it, but I felt sure. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a coyote, something curious. I boiled water again, made oatmeal, and tried to shake off the unease. The sun was up, the lake was calm, and everything looked normal. Still, I made a mental note to keep my knife and flashlight close that night. I spent the day exploring the edge of the lake, collecting firewood, and reading. I took some photos with my camera, wrote a few things in my journal, and tried to enjoy the stillness again. But part of my brain stayed alert. Every snap of a branch, every sudden gust of wind made me pause. That night, I didn't fall asleep right away. I lay in my sleeping bag, eyes wide open, listening. The forest sounds were louder somehow, or maybe I was just more aware of them. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they didn't circle the tent. They came from the same direction, north of the camp, and stopped maybe 20 feet away. I sat up slowly, grabbed my flashlight, and held it close. I still didn't unzip the tent. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. The steps didn't move for a long time. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The soft click of metal, like a buckle or a carabiner being fastened or released. It was faint, but clear in the quiet night. Then the steps moved away, slowly at first, then faster. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I walked the area where I thought the sound came from. Again, no tracks, no gear left behind, nothing to explain what I'd heard. I started wondering if I should pack up and leave, but a part of me didn't want to be chased out. I come out here for peace, and I didn't want fear to ruin it. But I started making plans just in case. I kept all my gear packed tight so I could leave quickly. I refilled my water bottles and made sure my GPS was working. I told myself that if anything strange happened again, I'd leave right away. That third night, I didn't even try to sleep. I stayed up, sitting inside the tent with the flashlight in my hand and a jacket wrapped around me. Hours passed. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I heard movement again. This time it was different. The steps weren't careful anymore. They were fast, stumbling, like someone running through the forest without a light. I could hear branches breaking, heavy breathing, and a weird dragging sound. My heart was pounding. It sounded like whoever it was had no idea where they were going, just crashing through the trees toward the lake. Then it stopped, not far from my tent. I waited, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. 10 minutes went by, then 20. Nothing. I stayed in place until dawn. When the sun rose, I finally unzipped the tent. Everything looked the same, calm, quiet, but I saw something new at the edge of the lake. A tree had long claw marks on its bark, deep and wide, like something sharp had been dragged across it. Not an animal mark, not like anything I'd seen before. It looked more like someone had taken a knife to the tree out of frustration or madness. That was it. I packed everything in under 20 minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't stop to take one last photo. I just shouldered my bag and headed back to the car. The hike back was tense. Every time I stopped to drink water, I listened. I kept checking behind me, making sure no one was following. At one point, I heard something again. Branches snapping far off to my right, but I didn't stop to look. I just walked faster. When I finally saw my car, I almost didn't believe it. I kept expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree, but no one did. I threw my pack in the back seat and got in. I locked the doors before even starting the engine. Back on the main road, I drove without stopping until I reached a gas station with people and lights and noise. I didn't tell anyone what happened. What would I say? That someone was stalking me in the woods? That I heard clicks and breathing and saw claw marks on a tree? I didn't want to sound crazy. That night, I stayed in a motel. I took the longest shower of my life, ate 2 microwave dinners, and left the TV on all night just for the sound. I couldn't stop thinking about those footsteps, how they changed from slow to frantic, how whoever it was didn't seem lost. They seemed focused. Over the next few weeks, I kept replaying it all in my head. I even went online and searched for anything strange about Stewart Lake. Nothing came up. No missing hikers, no local stories, no signs of trouble. Just a quiet, remote lake in Idaho. Eventually, I stopped looking. I knew what I heard. I knew I wasn't imagining things, but I also knew I'd never get answers. That's the part that stuck with me, the not knowing. The feeling that someone was out there, watching, waiting, maybe living off the grid, maybe just playing a game. I'll never be sure. What I am sure of is that I'll never go back there again. I still camp sometimes, but never alone. Never that deep in the woods. That trip taught me that it doesn't take a monster or a ghost to scare you. Just a few quiet footsteps in the dark. Just a few things that don't make sense. And when your instincts tell you something is wrong, they probably are. I listened to mine just in time. If I'd It started with a plan to get away from everything for a few days. I had been working nonstop for months, the kind of routine where days blurred together, waking up, commuting, staring at a screen, eating the same things, going to bed, and doing it all again. I was exhausted in a way I couldn't explain, not just tired, drained. I needed space, real space. I didn't want people, noise, or even cell service. I just wanted quiet, dirt, trees, and the sound of my own breath. That's why I chose a small, less-traveled national forest in Oregon I'd only read about once online. It wasn't a tourist destination or a well-known park, just a patch of preserved forest land with a few scattered trails and one small, remote campground tucked about 8 miles off a forest road. No reservations, no rangers, just you and whatever you brought in. I prepped for 2 weeks, packed carefully. I brought enough food for 4 days, canned stuff, trail mix, a few freeze-dried meals, and water purification tablets. I had a small camp stove, a quality tent, sleeping bag, and a simple but reliable GPS device with downloaded maps. I brought a knife, a flashlight, backup batteries, and a whistle. I was ready, or at least I thought I was. I drove up from Portland and got to the last town near the forest edge by early afternoon. I gassed up and bought a few last-minute things: a lighter, a second power bank for my GPS, and a small bottle of bug spray. Then I headed into the woods. The forest road leading to the campground wasn't paved. It was narrow, dirt-packed, winding deeper and deeper into thick trees that leaned over the road like they were trying to shut out the light. I passed one car coming the other way, an older man in a pickup who gave me a short wave. I nodded back, but something about his eyes stuck with me. It wasn't fear, just something unreadable. I reached the trailhead by late afternoon, parked, and shouldered my pack. The hike to the campground was another 2 miles in. The trail wasn't well maintained, overgrown in places, narrow, and barely marked. I used the GPS more than once to stay on track, but eventually I made it. The campground was small, 5 official sites spread out in a loop, but all unmarked. No one else was there, just silence and tall trees and a carpet of needles underfoot. I picked a site a little off the loop, closer to a slope that led down to a small stream. The air smelled clean. The ground was soft. I set up my tent facing the trees with my back to the stream. I felt good, tired, but calm in a way I hadn't felt in months. That first night was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, listened to the stream, and lay back on a log with my headlamp off. The stars came out through gaps in the branches. I slept well, waking only once when I heard some rustling nearby, probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. I rolled over and went back to sleep. The next day I went exploring. No trails past the camp, just wilderness. I marked my starting point on the GPS and moved slow, careful not to get turned around. I followed the stream uphill for a while, then veered off into a patch of thicker woods. I wasn't going anywhere in particular, just walking, breathing, letting the quiet settle into me. I saw a snake sunning itself on a rock and stepped around it. Found a rusted beer can half buried in the dirt. Looked old, maybe from the 80s. I found an old fire ring too, long dead and moss-covered, at least half a mile from the campground. No trail leading to it. Probably an old site from before the forest was protected. By late afternoon, I made my way back to camp. Nothing felt off. I was tired but content. I made dinner and sat by the stream with my feet in the water. The cold stung, but it felt good. That night, though, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't rustling like an animal. It was slower, a soft crunching of pine needles, very faint but steady, like something walking, not close but not far either. I stayed still, listening. It didn't sound like a 4-legged animal. There was a pause between steps, almost too rhythmic. Human? I thought about calling out, but I didn't want to break the silence unless I had to. After maybe a minute, the sound faded. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the roof of the tent. In the morning, I told myself it was probably nothing. Another camper walking around. or maybe just the woods playing tricks on my ears. But when I got out of the tent, I noticed something. A small stick had been stuck into the ground about 20 feet from the tent. It wasn't there before. It wasn't a branch that fell. It had clearly been placed pointing straight up, like a tiny marker. I walked over and stared at it. It was clean, no bark, stripped and smoothed. I pulled it out and tossed it down the slope toward the stream. I didn't want it near me. Still, I told myself it didn't mean anything. Kids probably left it and I just didn't notice it yesterday. Still, I packed my gear tighter that morning. If I needed to leave quickly, I wanted to be ready. I hiked again that day but didn't go as far. Stayed closer to the site. Didn't stray from the stream. I kept glancing around more than I had the day before. Every snapped twig made me pause. I found myself gripping the knife on my belt when I walked. I hated that. I didn't want to feel like I had to be on guard out here. But something about that stick unsettled me more than I like to admit. That night, I triple-checked my perimeter. I tied some spare paracord between two trees and hung an empty tin can from it so it would rattle if something walked through. I set it about 30 feet out, right along the path that circled the loop of the campground. I didn't know if it would help, but it made me feel a little more in control. Around 3 a.m., I heard the can rattle. Just once. A single clink. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding. I grabbed the flashlight and the knife and waited, holding my breath. The sound didn't come again. No more steps. No more noise at all. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat upright in the tent, listening to every creak of the forest. When dawn finally came, I got out and checked the cord. The can had been knocked sideways. Not off, just moved enough to swing. I looked for tracks, but the pine needles didn't hold impressions well. I couldn't tell if it was a person, an animal, or the wind. But the wind hadn't blown hard that night. It had been still, too still. I decided I wasn't going to stay another night. I planned 4 days, but I was cutting it to 3. I wanted out. I packed slowly and deliberately, staying alert. I kept thinking maybe someone had found my site and was messing with me. Maybe they wanted to scare me off. Or maybe they were just messing around without realizing I was there. But it didn't feel random. That stick, the sound, the can, it felt like someone was watching. Just after noon, as I was tightening the straps on my pack, I heard something that stopped me cold. A whistle. Faint, far off, but unmistakable. One long note, then silence. I waited, staring into the trees. Nothing moved. I turned and started hiking back toward the trailhead. I moved fast, eyes scanning, hands tense. About half a mile in, I passed a tree with something carved into the bark. A shape, just a circle with a line through it. It didn't mean anything to me, but it didn't look old. The wood beneath the bark was still pale, freshly cut. I moved faster. Another half mile and I heard something behind me. Not close, but loud enough to make me stop. A branch breaking. I spun around. Nothing. No movement. No figures. But the air felt different. Charged. Like I wasn't alone. I didn't stop again after that. I half ran the last stretch, ignoring the weight of my pack, pushing through brush and ducking branches until I saw the car. When I reached the lot, my car was still there. But something had been moved. My rearview mirror had been twisted sideways. Just slightly. Not broken. Just adjusted. I unlocked the door, threw my pack in, and got in. I locked the doors before I even started the engine. My hands were shaking. I drove out faster than I should have, bouncing over the ruts in the dirt road, not caring. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement again. An hour later. I didn't go home right away. I drove to a motel 2 towns over and checked in. I stayed there that night, locked the door, kept the light on. I lay awake for hours, just listening. The next morning, I checked the car again. No damage, nothing missing, but I still felt like something had been too close, like someone had been watching me, following me. I thought about going to the police, but what would I even say? That someone might have whistled in the woods? That my mirror was adjusted? It would sound paranoid, and maybe it was, but it didn't feel that way. I never went back to that forest. I didn't camp again for a long time after that. When I finally did, it was in a public site, full of other people, cars, noise, and ranger stations. I still think about that stick, the carved tree, the whistle. Sometimes I wonder if it was just one person out there or more. I decided to go camping alone in late September, just before the weather turned too cold. I needed a break from everything. Work had been eating away at me for months, and I hadn't had a proper break in over a year. I didn't want to go to a resort or hotel or anywhere that had people around. I wanted to get far away, somewhere quiet, somewhere where I could hear nothing but wind through trees and birds in the distance. So I packed up my old Tacoma with the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, some freeze-dried meals, a Jetboil stove, water, a small hatchet, a headlamp, and a few other things, and I drove out to a place I'd been once before years ago in Oregon's Umpqua National Forest. The last time I went, it was with a couple of friends, and we stayed near a small river off a fire road that branched out from Highway 138. That area was dense with Douglas firs and moss-covered rocks, and the deeper you went in, the quieter it got. This time, I went even further in, past the spot we'd camped at before. The fire road turned into rough gravel, and after a while, it was barely more than dirt with potholes big enough to swallow a wheel. I followed it for over an hour until I hit a clearing that looked untouched. No tire tracks, no fire pits. Felt like no one had been out there in years. That was exactly what I wanted. I parked the truck at the edge of the clearing, right under a big pine that had half its limbs drooping down like a curtain. I set up my tent on a patch of grass that was mostly flat and unpacked everything slowly. There was no rush. The air was cool and dry, the kind that makes you breathe deeper without realizing. I got my gear in place, dug a little trench around the tent in case it rained, and gathered some deadfall wood just in case I wanted a small fire later on. I didn't plan to make much noise, just some reading, maybe writing in the notebook I brought, and mostly doing nothing. That was the goal. Just be still for a while. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some rice and beans, watched the last bit of sun disappear behind the trees, and crawled into my sleeping bag early. I didn't sleep great, mostly because of the unfamiliar sounds. Every rustle outside the tent made me alert. That's always how the first night is when you're alone in the woods. Your mind keeps trying to assign meaning to every little sound. A snapping twig feels like a threat. A distant hoot from an owl feels like a warning. But I knew it was just noise, nature doing what it does. I drifted in and out of sleep until morning came, gray and quiet. The second day, I hiked around for hours. I followed a dry creek bed down into a hollow that smelled like wet stone and earth. The rocks were slippery with moss, and fallen trees lay across the path like natural bridges. I took photos, climbed up a low ridge, and found an old hunter's blind that was falling apart, its canvas roof shredded by weather. There were no fresh tracks anywhere, no signs of people. Just deer trails and the occasional scat from elk or maybe bear. But it looked old, nothing fresh. By the time I got back to camp, it was late afternoon. I was sweaty and tired, but relaxed in a way I hadn't felt in months. I made food, ate slowly, and sat on a stump watching the light change through the trees. Felt good. I felt like myself again. That night, I fell asleep quicker. I was more used to the sounds, but something woke me up around 3 in the morning. It wasn't loud, just a feeling, really, a sense that something was off. I stayed still, listening. There was no wind, no insects, just silence. That unnatural kind of silence where even the forest seems to hold its breath. I sat up and turned on my headlamp, but I didn't hear or see anything. No movement near the tent, no shapes in the dark. After about 10 minutes, I told myself it was nothing and went back to sleep, though not as easily. The next day, I stayed closer to camp. I didn't want to hike far. I cleaned up the area a bit, organized my gear, and spent a long time just sitting with my back against a tree. It was nice, but every now and then, I kept thinking about the silence from the night before, stuck in my head. Not in a panicky way, but enough to feel like a tiny itch I couldn't scratch. I told myself maybe a large animal passed through, and that was enough to make everything go quiet for a while. Later in the day, I found something odd about 30 yards from my tent. There was a patch of dirt, not big, maybe 2 feet wide, that looked like it had been disturbed. The leaves on top were brushed aside, and the soil looked freshly turned. I hadn't walked over that spot before. I would have noticed it. I crouched down and brushed some of the dirt with a stick. It wasn't deep, just a shallow pit, maybe 4 inches down. It didn't look like an animal dig. No claw marks. It looked deliberate, but there was nothing in it, just dirt. That night, I didn't sleep well at all. I kept hearing things. Nothing loud, just faint, irregular sounds. A single twig snap here, a soft shuffle there. The kind of noises that don't mean much on their own but start to feel strange when they happen just far enough apart that they seem intentional. I lay still for what felt like hours, listening. I didn't want to unzip the tent and look out. That was a line I didn't want to cross unless I had to. Eventually, the sound stopped, and I fell asleep, but it wasn't restful. In the morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. The tarp I kept over the cooler had been removed. It wasn't far, just pulled off and left next to it. But the cooler lid was open. I always latch it shut. Always. Nothing was taken. All the food was still there. Nothing was touched. It was like someone or something had opened it just to look inside. I stood there for a while just staring at it. My hands were cold even though the air wasn't. I repacked the cooler, latched it again, and this time I tied the tarp around it with cord. I decided I would leave the next morning. I'd planned to stay 5 days, but 4 was enough. I wasn't panicked, not yet, but I didn't like the feeling that something was toying with me. If it was an animal, it was acting strange. If it was a person, they were doing it quietly enough to stay out of sight for days. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of my campsite and marked some trees with strips of bright orange tape I had in my pack. I made a mental map of where everything was. I wanted to know if anything changed overnight. That evening, I kept the fire going longer. I didn't cook anything. I wasn't hungry. I just sat by the flames until they died down to coals and then got into the tent. I didn't take off my clothes or boots. I lay there fully dressed with my headlamp strapped on and my hatchet next to me. I didn't plan to sleep much. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. Soft, deliberate footsteps. Not animal steps. These were slow. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. They were coming from behind the tent, maybe 15 feet away. I stayed completely still, not even breathing through my mouth. The steps stopped. Then I heard what sounded like breathing. Not deep, not loud, just faint exhaling, like someone trying to stay quiet but too close to hide it completely. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I waited. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually the breathing stopped. No more footsteps, just silence again. And this time it didn't fade, it just ended all at once, like someone had held their breath and walked away without sound. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light came through the trees, I got out of the tent and checked everything. The trees I marked all still had the tape, but something else had changed. On the dirt path I'd walked the day before, right in the center of the trail, someone had placed 3 small rocks in a perfect line, each one about the size of a plum, clean, like they'd been rinsed in a stream. And next to them, a small stick had been driven into the ground with a torn scrap of fabric tied to the end. It was black, like a piece of old t-shirt. I didn't touch any of it. I just stared at it for a while, then packed everything up as fast as I could without running. I loaded the truck in under 15 minutes and got out of there. I drove faster than I should have down that rough fire road, bouncing over dips and scraping branches. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. When I got home, I reported it to the local ranger office. They took notes but didn't seem too concerned. Probably just some squatter, they said. Maybe someone out there living off-grid who didn't like visitors. Maybe, but they didn't come into my camp. They didn't take anything. They didn't make threats. They just let me know they were there, watching, moving in silence, leaving signs that didn't quite mean anything specific but still said enough. It's been over a year since that trip. I haven't gone back out alone since. I still think about it more than I'd like to. I think about that sound of breathing just outside the tent. The deliberate way the cooler was opened and closed. The untouched food. The perfect line of rocks. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They were already out there, watching me before I knew it, letting me know that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I got lucky. Whoever it was, they let me leave. I'll never know why they didn't do more, but I know what I felt, and I know I was being watched for days. I know I was being tested, and I know, without any doubt, that if I had stayed one more night, something would have happened. I don't need answers. I just needed to get out, and I did. It was late September when I took some time off work to clear my head. I'd been buried in deadlines and projects for months, and the stress was starting to pile up. I decided to go camping alone for a few days. I needed the kind of silence you can only find deep in the woods, away from phones, emails, and other people. I picked a spot in Idaho, near the Payette National Forest, not far from a river bend I'd fished once years ago with a friend. It was isolated, not many people hiked that far in, especially after the tourist season ended. That's what I wanted. No noise, no people, just me, my gear, and the woods. I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food for 5 days, bear spray, a sturdy knife, flashlight, extra batteries, a compact stove, water purification tablets, and a good pair of boots. I had a basic first aid kit, plenty of socks, and layers for warmth. Nights out there could get cold, especially with the way the weather had been dipping lately. I had checked the forecast: clear skies, no rain, temps in the 40s at night. That seemed manageable. I parked at a pull-off point along a Forest Service road and hiked about 8 miles in. The trail was mostly quiet except for the sound of wind moving through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. I saw a few deer in the distance, and once, a hawk flying overhead, its shadow skimming across the ground as it passed. Other than that, it felt like the forest belonged to me. The spot I picked for my tent was near the river, but high enough up that I didn't have to worry about flooding or damp ground. There was a flat clearing surrounded by trees, and a small slope that led down to the water. I set up camp around late afternoon, pitched the tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, stacked up some firewood, and got a small fire going. I boiled water for some instant rice and beef, sat back against a tree, and ate while watching the last light fade behind the trees. That first night, I slept deeply. I didn't wake up once, which was rare for me, especially outdoors. I woke just before sunrise, cold and stiff but clear-headed. The sky was pale blue with streaks of orange. I made coffee with my camp stove and watched the light spill over the trees. I stayed there most of the morning, reading an old paperback I brought with me and taking short walks along the river. The second night, I started feeling a little off. Nothing big, just a weird sense that something wasn't right. I told myself it was just the loneliness getting to me. I wasn't used to being completely alone, and the silence was starting to get under my skin. I thought maybe I just needed to keep myself busier. I fished for a while in the river but didn't catch anything. That evening, I chopped more wood and made a better fire than the night before. I heated up some soup and ate slowly, listening to the crackle of the fire and the wind in the trees. It helped a bit. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. I kept thinking I heard something outside. Not animals exactly, more like faint sounds that didn't fit. Once I thought I heard a whistle, far off. Another time it was like a thud, soft but sharp, like someone had dropped a rock onto packed dirt. I stayed in my sleeping bag, ears straining in the dark. I told myself again and again it was just forest noise. Trees settling, branches falling, maybe an animal nosing around. But something about it didn't sit right. I eventually drifted off, but it was a light sleep. The third day, I decided to hike farther upriver. I figured maybe some exercise would shake off the unease. I took a day pack with snacks, water, and my knife, and followed the river for a couple of miles. The terrain got steeper and the trees thicker. I found a small hill with a good view and sat there for a while, trying to enjoy the silence. But again, that feeling crept back, like I was being watched. I scanned the trees around me, but nothing moved. I didn't see anything. Still, I cut the trip short and headed back to camp by early afternoon. That evening, while collecting wood, I found something that made me stop cold. A tree, maybe 40 feet from my tent, had deep marks cut into it. Not scratches from an animal, these were clean, vertical cuts, all about the same length in a tight group, like someone had taken a knife or a hatchet and carved into the bark. They were fresh. The wood was still damp. I hadn't seen them before, and I was sure I would have noticed. I stood there for a long time staring at them. My first thought was another camper, maybe someone messing around. But I hadn't seen a single person since I left my truck. Not even tracks. The trail I came in on was covered with pine needles and soft dirt. No boot prints, no trash, nothing to suggest anyone else had been out here recently. I walked in a wide loop around my camp, scanning trees, checking the ground. I didn't find anything else strange. Still, the marks didn't sit right with me. That night, I made the fire bigger and sat up later. I kept the flashlight near me and the bear spray within reach. I didn't eat much. I kept turning toward the woods, scanning for movement. I didn't hear anything unusual, but the silence now felt tense, like something was holding its breath. Around midnight, I finally went into the tent, but I didn't sleep much. I kept imagining footsteps outside, twigs snapping. I thought I heard something brush the side of the tent once, but when I shined the light, nothing was there. No prints, no noise, just the dark. The fourth morning, I was exhausted. I made coffee, but it didn't help. My nerves were worn thin. I told myself maybe it was just paranoia. Maybe I was reading too much into things. But something had changed. The woods didn't feel calm anymore. They felt like they were pressing in, watching. I debated packing up and heading back, but I kept telling myself I was overreacting. I didn't want to ruin the trip because of my own imagination. I spent most of that day close to camp. I stayed alert, checked the area again for any signs of other people. Nothing. Around late afternoon, I went to gather more firewood. That's when I found the second set of tree markings. About 30 yards from the first, different tree. Same kind of cuts. Same direction, same depth. Still fresh. I stared at them for a long time. That's when the realization really hit. Someone else was out here. Someone close. And they knew I was here too. I walked quickly back to camp, heart pounding. I tried to calm myself down, but my thoughts were racing. Who would be out here, not making contact, not leaving signs, just marking trees? Why those marks? What did they mean? It didn't feel like something innocent. It felt deliberate, like I was being watched or warned. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the fire going as long as I could. I sat with my back against a tree, flashlight in hand, scanning the woods every few minutes. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but the dread kept growing. I felt surrounded, even though nothing moved. I kept checking the time on my watch. Every hour crawled by like it was 3. Around 4 a.m., the fire finally died down, and I let it. I was too tired to keep feeding it. The cold crept in and sat heavy on my shoulders. As the sky began to lighten, I made a decision. I was done. I'd break camp and head out first thing. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. I needed to leave. I packed fast but methodically. I didn't eat. I just broke everything down and stuffed it into my pack. By the time the sun was fully up, I was on the trail heading back the way I came. The hike felt longer than it had on the way in. I kept checking over my shoulder. Every sound made me jump. Once, I stopped to drink water and saw fresh boot prints on the trail behind me. They weren't mine. They pointed the same direction I was going, but the tread didn't match my boots. They looked newer and the stride was longer. Someone had come this way. After me, I started moving faster. My pack bounced with each step, but I didn't care. I just wanted to reach the road. I didn't stop again, not even when I got blisters. I pushed through the pain. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the pull-off. My truck was still there. No one else's vehicle. I threw my gear in the bed, climbed in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a long minute before starting the engine, just breathing, trying to calm down. Then I drove. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station, nearly 30 miles away. I used the bathroom, bought some food and coffee, and sat in the truck with the engine running. I kept watching the road, expecting to see another car pull in behind me, but nothing ever did. I never reported anything. I didn't have proof, just marks on trees and a gut feeling that something wasn't right. But I know what I felt out there. I know what I saw. Someone else was in those woods with me. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who came close enough to leave marks, to follow me without a sound. I haven't gone camping alone since then. I still hike, but only in busy areas near towns where other people are around. I still love the outdoors, but I don't trust the deep woods anymore. Not the way I used to. That trip reminded me how small and alone we really are out there. No cell service, no help, just trees, silence, and whatever. It was early September when I finally took time off and decided to go camping alone. I had just turned 34, and between long shifts at the warehouse and constant city noise, I felt like I hadn't taken a real breath in months. I didn't want a popular campground or a place with other people around. I needed to be alone, somewhere quiet, deep enough in the woods where I wouldn't hear a single car or phone or voice. I found a spot on an old topo map that looked promising, several miles off the main road in the Cascade Mountains in Washington state. It didn't look like it had official trails, but it was surrounded by national forest land, meaning I could legally hike in and camp without any permits or issues. I spent 2 days gathering gear, checking the weather, loading my pack, and going over the area on Google Earth to get an idea of the terrain. The forecast was clear, cool days and colder nights, but no rain expected. I packed light but careful. I brought a small one-man tent, a decent sleeping bag, my old hiking boots, 3 days of food, a water filter, 2 knives, a headlamp, and a small hatchet. I had my phone, though I didn't expect reception, and a power bank that could last me all weekend. My plan was to hike in on Friday morning, set up camp near a small creek I'd seen on the satellite map, spend the weekend alone, and hike out Sunday before dark. I drove out early Friday and parked my car at a small pull-off on a Forest Service road. There were no signs, no parking area, just a spot wide enough for my car to be out of the way. I locked it up, double-checked the map, and started hiking east through dense trees, aiming for the little creek. It was slow going at first. There wasn't a trail, so I had to bushwhack, but I found deer paths here and there and used those to make my way deeper into the forest. The land rose and fell in long ridges, and the trees were thick, mostly fir and hemlock, with a few big cedars that looked hundreds of years old. The undergrowth wasn't too bad. I made decent time. By early afternoon, I reached the creek. It was exactly where it was supposed to be. A narrow ribbon of cold, clear water cutting through mossy stones and ferns. I followed it downstream a short way and found a flat patch of ground a little above the waterline, ringed by trees. Felt perfect. Hidden, quiet, soft forest floor. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, hung my food in a dry bag from a nearby tree branch, and sat down on a log to rest. The quiet was deep out there. No distant engines or airplanes, just birds and the faint sound of water. I felt like I could finally breathe. That first night was peaceful. I cooked some rice and dried vegetables over my little stove, ate slowly, and then walked a slow loop around the area to get familiar with it. I always do that when I'm camping alone. Get a sense of what the trees look like from every direction, find markers I can use to get back to camp in case I get turned around. I found a fallen log shaped like a bent elbow, a tree with a patch of white bark, and a boulder covered in moss with a deep crack running down its middle. I kept those mental images sharp. Then I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and lay there listening to the wind move through the canopy above me. I slept better than I had in months. The next morning, I woke up early and cold. The sun hadn't quite reached the forest floor yet, and my breath came out in clouds. I got up, filtered some water from the creek, made oatmeal, and sat on the same log eating while the forest slowly woke up. I didn't have plans for the day except to hike around, maybe follow the creek upstream and see where it led. I left camp after stashing my gear and headed out with a small day pack, a knife, and some snacks. I followed the water for an hour or so, stepping over fallen trees and rocks, crossing back and forth as it twisted through the woods. I didn't find anything remarkable, no big waterfalls or animal prints, but it felt good just moving, breathing in clean air. Eventually, I stopped and turned back. On the way to camp, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A piece of red cloth stuck on a branch near the ground. It was small, maybe the size of a napkin, and looked old, torn at the edges. I figured it was probably from a hunter or another hiker from long ago. Still, it was strange. I hadn't seen any signs of people out here at all. No trash, no footprints, nothing. Just that cloth, faded and worn. I looked around but didn't see anything else. Back at camp, I ate lunch and sat with my feet in the creek. That evening, I lit a small fire in a ring I made from rocks and sat watching the flames. The stillness of the woods changed around dusk. It always does. Birds quiet down. The air cools fast. Shadows stretch out. But something felt different this time. It was subtle. The quiet became too quiet. No bugs, no owls, not even the sound of branches creaking. Just stillness. It made the hair on my arms stand up. I sat very still and listened. Nothing, just the sound of the fire cracking. I decided to put the fire out and turn in early. I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, suddenly aware of how thin the nylon walls were. I lay there in my bag, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm down. I told myself it was just normal wood stuff. Sometimes animals go quiet if there's a predator around, or it could be the temperature dropping. I eventually fell asleep, but it wasn't deep sleep. I kept waking up to faint noises. Cracks, snaps, soft rustling that could have been wind or small animals. But it never felt far away. It felt close. I didn't unzip the tent. I just lay there, frozen, gripping the knife I kept in my bag. In the morning, I felt tired and jittery. I got out of the tent, stretched, and checked around the camp. Nothing looked disturbed. The food bag was untouched. No prints in the soft dirt. I felt stupid for being so anxious. I ate, packed up my day pack again, and hiked in a new direction, moving slowly, taking my time. The trees were older and denser that way. I went maybe a mile before I saw it. Another piece of cloth, this time blue, stuck to the bark of a tree at shoulder height. It wasn't the same type of fabric as before. This looked newer, and it had a small fray where it had clearly been torn. That unsettled me. Two different pieces of cloth, different colors, different types, in different spots, miles apart. I stood there for a long time staring at it. I scanned the woods in every direction. Nothing moved. I suddenly felt like I was being watched. The kind of feeling that sneaks up on you and sinks into your chest. I backed away slowly, then turned and walked quickly back toward camp. I didn't run, but my heart was thudding the whole time. I kept checking over my shoulder. Back at camp, I took my food bag down and sat thinking. I still had one more night planned, but I felt off, like something wasn't right. I thought about packing up and hiking out early, but I didn't want to get caught in the dark. I told myself again that it was probably just trash from old campers or hunters, but there was no sign of other camps, and both pieces of cloth looked like they had been torn off something, not dropped or discarded. I didn't feel hungry. I didn't feel tired. I just felt watched. I stayed close to camp the rest of the day. I made sure everything was in place, kept my gear packed up except for what I needed, and kept my knife on me the whole time. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling. As the sun started to set, the silence came again. That same thick, unnatural stillness. I didn't build a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate cold food, sat still for a long time, then crawled into the tent and lay there wide awake. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard something. Not rustling, not snapping, breathing. Slow, steady breathing right outside the tent wall. Not an animal. It was too controlled, too quiet, like someone trying not to be heard but breathing too close to hold it in. I froze. My mouth went dry. I held my breath, afraid it would hear me. The sound didn't move, stayed right outside, a few feet from my head. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't blink. After what felt like forever, it stopped. Just stopped. No footsteps, no crunching leaves. Just gone. I stayed awake the rest of the night, heart pounding in my ears, hand wrapped around the knife under my bag. I didn't unzip the tent. Couldn't. As soon as the first light touched the inside of the nylon, I unzipped it, grabbed my pack, and left everything else. Tent, stove, food, I left it all. I didn't care. I just needed to get out of the woods. I hiked faster than I ever had before, retracing my steps as best I could, using the landmarks I remembered. The mossy boulder, the white bark tree, the fallen log. I didn't stop. I didn't eat. I didn't even drink until I was almost back at the road. When I reached my car and saw it still sitting there untouched, I almost cried. I got in, locked the doors, and drove straight home without stopping. I never reported it. What would I even say? I didn't see anyone. I didn't see anything. Just pieces of cloth and a breath in the dark. But something was out there, watching, waiting, maybe following. I'll never know who it was or what. The sun had set a few hours ago, and the forest around me was alive with the sounds of the night. I sat on the log, poking at the campfire with a stick, watching the orange glow flicker and dance. The heat from the fire was a welcome relief from the chill that had started to settle into the air. It was a cool evening, but the fire kept me warm enough. The smell of burning would mix with the fresh, earthy scent of the trees around me. The crackling and popping sounds of the fire were the only things breaking the silence. I had been camping alone for 2 days now. I'd taken a few days off work and decided to spend some time away from everything. No distractions, no phones, no people. Just the quiet of the wilderness. I was used to camping, having done it often as a kid with my dad. But I hadn't been out in the woods alone in years. The peace was something I was starting to appreciate more than I had before. The world felt distant, and for once, I wasn't thinking about the stress of work or any other responsibilities. The campsite I'd picked was deep in the woods, far from any hiking trails or roads. I had spent the better part of the morning making sure I was fully set up, chopping wood for the fire and making sure my tent was secure. I had a good spot by a small stream that cut through the trees, the water running quietly over rocks. It was an ideal place to just relax and let go of everything for a while. But now, as I sat by the fire, there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It was nothing specific, just an instinct that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The kind of feeling you get when you're being watched, even though you're alone. The forest around me felt unnervingly quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. I shrugged it off. It was probably just the isolation getting to me. Being out here in the woods alone could mess with your mind, especially when night fell and everything seemed to get 10 times more intense. I threw a few more logs on the fire and adjusted my position on the log to get more comfortable. As the night wore on, the sounds of the forest seemed to get louder. The wind had picked up slightly, sending the trees swaying. The air felt colder, too, as though something had shifted. I could hear small animals scurrying around in the underbrush, and occasionally, a branch would snap in the distance. But there was something else, something I couldn't ignore. Every now and then, I could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking through the forest. Not close, but close enough for me to hear. At first, I thought it might be another camper. There were a few campsites in the area, but they were all a good distance away. The footfalls didn't sound like they were coming from the direction of any of the other sites, though. They sounded off, not normal, almost too measured, like someone was trying to hide their presence, but wasn't quite doing a good job of it. I stood up and grabbed the flashlight from my bag. I wasn't scared, not yet, but I was curious. I shone the light around the area, sweeping it through the trees. Nothing. The beam caught only the distant shadows of the forest, the outlines of trees and thick underbrush. There was nothing out there. I stood there for a minute listening. The footsteps had stopped. Maybe it was just a deer or some other animal. It was likely, I told myself. The forest was full of life, and sometimes those noises could play tricks on you. But then I heard it again, this time closer. Footsteps, crunching leaves, soft but unmistakable. I froze, holding my breath. The light from my flashlight trembled slightly in my grip as I slowly turned to face the noise. I didn't want to call out. I didn't want to make any noise that might attract attention. Instead, I crouched down low, hoping to stay hidden in the shadows of the firelight. The footsteps were getting closer. I could hear them in the dead silence of the night, and with each step, my anxiety grew. I had no idea what to do. My mind raced, running through possible scenarios. Was it just another camper? A hiker who had gotten lost? Or was it something else? I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts. No, there was no reason to panic. It was probably nothing, but the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, closer. I moved slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to find out what was going on. The sound of the footsteps was now unmistakable, like someone walking carefully through the woods, trying not to make a sound, but still failing. I slowly picked up a small log from the ground and crept toward the edge of the campsite, where the trees grew thick. The flashlight beam was barely cutting through the shadows now, but I kept it steady, aiming it toward the sound. Then I saw something, a shadow, a figure, just barely visible between the trees, moving slowly in my direction. I froze, my body stiff. It was a person, at least I thought it was, but I couldn't make out any details. They were too far away, hidden in the shadows, but I could feel their presence. I could hear their breathing now, slow and deliberate, matching the footsteps. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just stood there watching. The figure moved closer, stepping carefully between the trees. My heart thudded in my chest, louder than ever. Then, without warning, the figure stopped, just standing there, still in the dark. I could see nothing now. The shadows were too thick, and the firelight didn't reach far enough. I was on edge, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed. It felt like hours, but in reality, it was only a few moments before I heard the soft rustling of leaves as the figure began to move again. This time, though, it wasn't heading toward the campsite. It was moving away. I waited, listening. The sound of footsteps slowly faded into the distance, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I didn't move for a long time. My mind raced. What the hell had just happened? I stood there, my flashlight in my hand, my heart still pounding. My mind was spinning, trying to piece together what had happened. Had I imagined it? Was it just some figment of my imagination, playing tricks on me? It didn't feel like it. The footsteps were real. The figure had been real, but they were gone now, and I was still here, alone. I slowly walked back to the fire, my legs unsteady beneath me. I dropped down onto the log, still shaking. It was probably nothing. I told myself again. Probably just some hiker who had lost their way. I decided then to stay up for a while longer. I didn't want to sleep. Not yet. I wasn't sure if I could. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like I had been overreacting. It was just the woods. The forest was full of strange noises, and things could seem much more frightening in the dark. Maybe it had been a raccoon or some other animal, I reasoned. But the thought of someone walking around out there, so close, still made my skin crawl. Eventually, I settled down a little. The fire crackled and popped, casting long shadows on the ground. The forest was quiet again, the only sounds coming from the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. I kept my eyes on the dark edges of the campsite, the shadows between the trees. My body was still tense, but the minutes dragged on, and nothing happened. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I felt safe enough to fall asleep. Exhaustion overtook me, and I finally let my guard down. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and tried to ignore the unsettling feeling in my gut. But that night, I didn't sleep soundly. Every sound, every crackling branch outside, made me jump. Every gust of wind against the trees had my heart racing. I was on edge, my thoughts never fully leaving the events of the evening. It wasn't until the first light of dawn crept through the tent that I allowed myself to fully relax, my breathing finally slowing. By the time the sun had risen and the light began filtering through the trees, I was up and packing my things. I had decided I was done with this campsite. Maybe it was all in my head, but I didn't care. I was ready to leave. As I packed up my gear, I thought about the figure I had seen, or thought I had seen, out there in the darkness. I still didn't understand it, but I was certain about one thing. I was going to find a different spot next time. The forest was beautiful, but it held a certain darkness that I wasn't ready to face again. By the time I had everything packed and ready to go, I had made up my mind. I was heading home, and as I walked away from the campsite, I took one last look over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowed figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. But there was nothing, just the forest, quiet, still, as if nothing had ever happened. I left the woods that morning feeling both relieved and unsettled. The memory of the footsteps would stay with me for a long time, but the experience was over now, and that was enough. I had planned a solo camping trip for early October, thinking it would be a good time to catch the last bit of fall before the cold truly settled in. The leaves were turning, the bugs were mostly gone, and most people were back to their routines after summer. I picked a place in northern Utah, near Logan Canyon, away from any main trail, a spot I found last year while hiking with friends. It wasn't part of an official campground, just a quiet place near a shallow creek, surrounded by tall pines and big granite boulders. No cell signal, which I liked. I wanted quiet, just me, a tent, some gear, and 3 days to disconnect. I parked my car on a dirt turnout along the main forest road and hiked about 2 miles in with my pack. The air was cool but not cold, just the way I liked it. The trail was narrow, half-worn, probably made by deer more than people. I followed it until I found that familiar clearing I remembered. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the creek nearby made just enough noise to drown out the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and collected some wood to get a fire going before it got dark. I brought a small hatchet for kindling, a camping stove for meals, and a metal container to boil water. I also brought a bear canister and followed the usual rules. Keep food sealed, don't cook near the tent, hang what you need to. The first night went fine. I sat by the fire after eating freeze-dried beef stew and a protein bar. I watched the flames, listened to the water trickle nearby, and felt that usual sense of calm settle over me. When I finally crawled into my tent and zipped myself into the bag, I fell asleep faster than I thought I would. I woke up once or twice to adjust my body, maybe roll over, but nothing unusual. The second day was quiet too. I went exploring past the creek, climbing some low hills and looking out at the distant valleys. I found some small animal tracks near the muddy edge of the water, probably raccoon or fox. I didn't see any large animal scat, which was a relief. Around midday, clouds started moving in, just enough to block out the sun. I checked the weather again on my emergency radio, and it said light rain was possible overnight. No big deal. I had a solid tent and good gear. I boiled some water for coffee in the afternoon and just sat on a boulder watching the wind shift through the tree branches. That night, I turned in around 9 after dousing the fire completely and securing everything. The forest was darker than the night before. Heavy cloud cover blocked the moon, and without that glow, everything was just black. I lay in my tent listening to the wind and the creek. Eventually, I drifted off, but something woke me a few hours later. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. There was no specific sound, no loud crack or animal call, just this strange stillness. The creek sounded quieter, like something had muffled it. The wind was gone. I lifted my head and unzipped the sleeping bag slowly. The air felt different, heavier. My body was alert in a way I didn't understand yet, like the kind of feeling you get walking into a room after an argument, where something invisible still lingers. I stayed still, just listening. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunches on the pine needles. Not an animal scurrying or bounding. Not the erratic movement of a raccoon or even a deer. This was heavy. A step. Pause. Another step. The spacing was too wide to be a small animal. Too slow to be a bear. I grabbed my flashlight and didn't turn it on yet. I waited. The footsteps circled wide around my tent. Then they stopped. I still didn't move. I tried to control my breathing, hoping it would just go away. A few minutes passed. Nothing. I heard the creek again. The usual noises returned. Eventually, I convinced myself it was probably a deer or maybe just my imagination exaggerating small sounds in the silence. I kept the flashlight next to me and drifted off again. The next morning, I walked a slow circle around the tent. There were boot prints, not mine. My boots had a worn sole with a half-peeled heel. These were different, deeper, wider, clean edges. Someone had walked around my tent while I slept. I stared at the prints for a long time. They came from the woods on the opposite side of the creek. I hadn't seen any trails over there. The prints went around the tent once, then back the way they came. No signs of trash or broken branches, just quiet, careful footsteps. That heavy feeling came back, like I was being watched. I packed up most of my stuff right away. I didn't want to overreact, but I also didn't want to stay if someone else was lurking out there. I kept my bear spray and hatchet within reach. I waited until mid-morning before I left, just to make sure the weather was clear and I wouldn't have to hike in the rain. The walk back to the car was slow. I kept looking behind me, stopping, listening, but I didn't see anything. When I finally got back to the car, I loaded everything fast and locked the doors as soon as I sat down. I drove back toward town, thinking that was the end of it. Maybe some other camper had wandered close. Weird, but not unheard of. Still, it didn't sit right. Back home, I cleaned my gear, stored the tent, and tried to push the whole thing out of my mind. A week later, I was scrolling through local news stories online, just killing time, when I saw a headline about a hiker who'd gone missing in the same part of the canyon. Same area, just a few miles north of where I'd camped. He was experienced, had left for a 3-day trip and never came back. His car was still parked at the same forest road turnout I had used. They hadn't found any of his gear. I kept refreshing the article over the next few days. More information came out slowly. Search and rescue had found signs of a camp, but it looked like someone else had been there too. They didn't say more, just that there were unusual disturbances. I didn't sleep much for a while after that. I started thinking about how remote that area was, how easy it would be for someone to wait out there, far from trails, away from cameras or rangers or regular people. Someone who knew the forest well, someone who didn't want to be found. The boot prints hadn't followed me, but they had come close enough to watch, close enough to know I was there. The worst part was how quiet they had been. Whoever it was, they didn't make a sound outside of those few steps. They didn't touch anything. They didn't leave a note or a warning. They just came close enough to circle the tent. Close enough that I felt it in my sleep. I haven't gone camping alone since then. I still hike. I still enjoy the mountains. But I don't sleep out there anymore unless I'm with someone else, and I never go back to the same spot twice. I got lucky. I packed up and left before anything else happened. Maybe nothing would've. Maybe they were just curious. But maybe not. All I know is that I was out there, in the dark, completely alone, and someone else was too. They didn't say anything. They didn't do anything. But they knew I was there, and they waited until I was asleep to come close. That silence still bothers me more than anything. Not knowing who they were or what they wanted. Just that they were watching. That was enough. I went camping alone in the late fall of 2017. I had some time off work and wanted to get away from everything for a few days. I was 33 at the time, living in Dayton, Ohio. I'd always enjoyed being outside, even if I didn't go on trips like this too often. I liked the quiet. The weather had started turning cold, and that was perfect for me. Fewer bugs, fewer people, and the woods always felt still and peaceful in the colder seasons. I picked a place in southern Kentucky near Lake Cumberland. It was a lesser-known area, not part of the main parks. I had found it online through a forum where backpackers shared their favorite hidden spots. Someone had posted about an old trail that used to be maintained years ago, but had slowly faded away as the state stopped funding its upkeep. They said it was still walkable if you didn't mind brush and some erosion. I didn't mind. That actually sounded ideal. I packed everything into my truck: tent, sleeping bag, thermal clothes, food for a few days, water filter, stove, batteries, flashlight, and a few knives. I also brought a signal flare and a whistle, even though I didn't expect to use them. I had a basic cell phone, but I doubted I'd get signal out there. I drove out early on a Thursday morning. The weather was clear, cold but not too cold, around 40 during the day and dipping to the low 30s at night. The roads got rougher the deeper I went. By mid-afternoon, I was driving on a gravel path through thick woods, barely wide enough for my truck. I eventually parked in a clearing that someone had clearly used before, judging by the old tire ruts and a burned-out fire ring. From there, I shouldered my pack and walked in. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, and it curved alongside a long ridge that overlooked the lake. There were leaves all over the ground, dry and crunchy. No sign of anyone else. I went in for about 2.5 hours before I decided to set up camp. I found a nice flat spot tucked between two hills. It was sheltered from the wind and not too close to any water, which I liked because it meant fewer animals passing by. I got the tent up and started boiling some water for food. It was quiet, with the occasional gust of wind shaking the trees and sending more leaves to the ground. The light was starting to go down. I ate, cleaned up, and crawled into my sleeping bag early. I remember thinking how silent it was. No cars, no voices, just the wind. That first night, I woke up to the sound of rustling outside the tent. I froze. It wasn't loud, but it was close. Not wind, not a branch falling. It was movement, something moving slowly through the leaves. I stayed still and listened. I kept thinking maybe it was a deer, but it didn't move like one. It didn't pass by quickly or run off. It just moved around, stopping now and then. I couldn't tell how many feet it had. I didn't hear hooves or anything distinct, just soft crunching. After a few minutes, it went quiet again. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. I had my knife next to me, gripped in my hand, and kept my headlamp close. By morning, I got out and looked around the area. I didn't see anything, no tracks, no disturbed leaves, nothing knocked over. But the woods were so full of leaf cover that small tracks might not have left a mark. I shook it off. Maybe it was just an animal like a raccoon or a fox. I had food sealed and packed well away from the tent, so nothing had messed with it. I ate a quick breakfast and decided to explore further down the trail. I took only my small day pack with water, food, and some basic gear. As I moved deeper, the trail got thinner. There were more fallen trees and spots where I had to guess which direction to go. I marked trees with colored tape so I wouldn't lose my way back. Around noon, I reached a rocky outcrop that gave a beautiful view of the lake below. I sat for a while and had lunch. While I was sitting, I felt this weird sensation that I was being watched. I kept turning around, looking up and down the trail. I didn't see anything, but the feeling stayed with me the whole time I sat there. It made my skin crawl. Eventually, I packed up and headed back. I got back to my camp in the late afternoon. I decided to move my tent a little further up the slope, just for peace of mind. The first spot had started to feel too exposed. The new location was more tucked in, hidden by a big fallen tree and thick undergrowth. I rebuilt my fire ring and boiled water again for dinner. That night, I kept the fire going longer and sat with my back to a tree. I was more alert than usual. Around 9 or 10, I heard that same rustling again. But this time, it was further out, and I could just barely see movement in the shadows beyond the firelight. I stood up slowly, knife in hand. The sound stopped again. I held my breath and waited. Nothing came closer.
No growls, no footsteps.
Just silence. Eventually, I went into my tent, leaving the fire burning low. I barely slept. I kept waking up, listening. Once or twice I thought I heard movement again, but I couldn't be sure. By morning, I felt exhausted and on edge. That day, I stayed closer to the campsite. I didn't want to go far. I spent most of the day gathering dry wood and trying to clear more of the area around my tent to make it harder for anything to sneak up on me. I still didn't know what it was. Could have been an animal or maybe even another person. That idea bothered me more than anything else. If someone was out there watching me, not saying anything, just circling around my camp at night, that was far worse than a curious animal. Around 3 in the afternoon, I found something weird. I was gathering wood when I noticed a small tree near my old camp spot had fresh bark stripped off. It was torn in long vertical lines, almost like claw marks, but too shallow and spaced oddly. Not deep gouges, more like someone had dragged a stick or a blade along it. I didn't remember seeing it before. It looked fresh. That unsettled me more than anything else so far. It didn't feel natural. I went back to camp early, made a larger fire, and made sure everything was packed and ready in case I needed to move fast. That night, I didn't even go inside the tent. I sat next to the fire with my back to the fallen tree and just waited. It was close to midnight when I saw a light. Faint, far off, barely noticeable through the trees down toward the direction of the old trail I had walked on the first day. It wasn't a flashlight beam, more like a faint glow, moving very slowly, like someone with a phone light or a lantern. Stopped now and then. I killed my fire instantly and crouched in the dark. My heart was hammering. I watched the light move closer by tiny amounts. It was still far, maybe 100 yards off, but definitely moving through the trees. Not fast, carefully, deliberately. I couldn't hear footsteps over the distance, but I knew someone was there. I stayed frozen for at least 20 minutes, watching it. Finally, the light stopped completely. It didn't move again. I stayed still for another hour, maybe more. It never came closer, but it also didn't go back. At some point, I lost sight of it. By dawn, I still hadn't seen it again. I got up slowly, stretched out my legs, and packed up everything. I didn't bother eating. I just wanted to get out. I didn't even take down the tent properly. I just stuffed it into my pack. I took a different route back, not following the trail. I moved uphill and followed the ridge, checking my compass constantly. It was harder, but I wanted to avoid the path I came in on. I was too scared that whoever or whatever that light belonged to would be waiting. The hike back took almost 6 hours. I didn't stop once. I kept moving, sweating even though it was cold. My legs burned, and my shoulders ached under the weight of the pack. When I got to my truck, I checked everything carefully before getting in. It hadn't been touched. I started the engine and drove out without looking back. I didn't stop until I hit the main road and finally got cell service. I pulled over and sat for a while. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there, holding the wheel, letting the tension bleed out of me. I drove straight home, unpacked my gear, and didn't say anything about the trip for a long time. Later, when I finally told a friend about it, they asked if maybe it was a hunter or a hiker. But if it was, why not say something? Why come that close to a camp, 2 nights in a row, and never speak, never show yourself clearly, just circle around? Why strip bark from a tree and leave no other sign? Why carry a dim light through the woods without a clear destination? I don't have answers. I haven't been camping alone since. I still go on hikes, still spend time outside, but I stay in known areas now. Places with people around, trails that are well used, where I can see someone coming before they're too close. That trip changed how I look at the woods. I still love them, but I know now that just because it's quiet doesn't mean you're alone. I was 32 the year I decided to take a week off and camp alone in northern Idaho. My job in Spokane had been draining the life out of me. Long days, pointless meetings, and a boss who had zero interest in anything but deadlines. I needed quiet. No phone, no emails, no people, just trees, dirt, and whatever thoughts came up in the silence. I'd camped a lot growing up. My dad took me and my brothers out all the time, but it had been years since I'd done it solo. Maybe I just wanted to prove I still could. I picked a spot not far from the Montana border, a small lake called Harper Lake that barely showed up on most maps. It wasn't totally off the grid, but it was close enough. You had to drive down a narrow dirt road for several miles after the last gas station, then hike another 3 miles through forest to get to the lake. I looked it up online and found only a handful of mentions on old hiking forums. That was perfect. The more remote, the better. I packed light but carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, dry food, fishing gear, emergency beacon, bear spray, knife, flashlight, batteries, water filter, the works. I had enough food for 7 days, and I planned to fish if I needed more. I loaded up my Jeep and left just after sunrise on a Saturday morning in late September. The leaves were starting to turn, and the air had that sharp edge that comes right before real cold sets in. My plan was to stay until Friday, maybe leave Saturday morning if the weather held up. The drive was long, around 6 hours with a few breaks for gas and snacks. By the time I hit the dirt road, it was almost 2 in the afternoon. I followed the winding trail carefully, slowing for ruts and watching for washouts. I passed one truck going the opposite direction about 10 minutes in, and the driver gave me a nod. Other than that, I didn't see anyone. When I reached the end of the road and parked near the trailhead, it felt like I'd crossed over into a different world. I loaded my pack, locked the Jeep, and started the hike. The trail wasn't well marked, but I downloaded offline maps and had a compass just in case. It felt good to walk, hard, but good. My legs burned and my shoulders ached by the time I reached the lake. But when I stepped out of the trees and saw the water, everything felt worth it. Harper Lake was small, maybe a quarter-mile across, perfectly round and lined with pines. The water was clear and still, with no signs of people, no trash, no footprints, not even old fire pits. I found a flat patch about 30 yards from the shore and started setting up camp. I put the tent near a low rock outcrop, laid out my gear, and boiled water for a quick dinner. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the whole lake turned gold for a few minutes before fading into blue shadow. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of wind in the trees and nothing else. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I hiked around the lake, fished from the shore, wrote in my journal, and let my thoughts wander. The air was cold but dry, and the sky stayed mostly clear. I only used my emergency beacon once a day to ping my location so my brother would know I was still okay. I kept my phone off otherwise. It was the fourth night, Tuesday, when I noticed something strange. I'd gone to bed early after a long hike up the ridge to the west. Around midnight, I woke up. Not to a noise exactly, but something had shifted. I lay still in my sleeping bag, listening. At first, it was just the usual creaks and rustles. Wind through branches, maybe a squirrel or something. But then I realized it was completely silent. No wind, no bugs, no movement, just the sound of my own breathing. That silence held for maybe a minute. Then I heard something crunch, not like a small animal. It was heavy, careful, like someone trying not to be heard but failing a little. I froze. My first thought was bear, but it didn't quite fit. Bears don't move like that. They don't stop and start like they're testing the ground. I reached slowly for the bear spray and held it in my sleeping bag. Another step, then nothing. I lay like that for what felt like forever, waiting. Eventually, I heard the sound fade away into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I found no tracks. The pine needles were thick, and the ground was hard. Whatever or whoever had been there didn't leave a trail I could follow. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe it was a deer. Maybe I imagined how heavy it sounded. Still, something about it stayed with me. I kept looking over my shoulder that day. I hiked out to the eastern edge of the lake where there was an old fire ring. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. I didn't see any sign of other people. That night, I built a fire and kept it burning longer than usual. I didn't like the idea of sleeping in total darkness again. I sharpened my knife just to keep my hands busy. When I finally went to bed, I left the rain fly open so I could see out. I lay awake a long time, staring up through the mesh at the stars. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. A slow step, then another, then nothing. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever it was might hear it. This time, the steps circled the tent. I gripped the bear spray and my knife, my hand shaking. The steps were slow, deliberate. They stopped for a long time, then picked up again, behind the tent now, closer to where my pack was hanging from a tree. Then silence. I waited. Maybe 20 minutes passed before I dared unzip the tent. The fire had burned down to coals. My pack was still there, untouched. I stayed up the rest of the night, staring into the woods with the flashlight on my lap. The first light, I searched again for tracks. I found none. But I did notice that one of the lower branches on the tree where my pack hung had been broken. Could have been the wind, but the break was clean and fresh. I considered packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to. I told myself it was probably just an animal. Maybe I was letting my imagination get the better of me. Still, I moved my camp farther from the woods, closer to the edge of the lake where I'd have a clearer view. The next night, I kept a fire going well into the early morning. I sat next to it with my back to a rock wall, bear spray in one hand, flashlight in the other. Nothing came that night. I started to think maybe it was over, but on Thursday afternoon, I found something that changed my mind. I was hiking along the ridge to get cell signal, just enough to check in. On the way down, I noticed something off the trail, a patch of earth that looked recently disturbed. I walked over and crouched. The ground had been dug up and then covered again clumsily. I started brushing it aside with a stick. Maybe an animal had buried something. About a foot down, I hit fabric. I froze. It was blue like a tarp or maybe a sleeping bag. I dug around it carefully and found what looked like an old pack. Faded, water-damaged. Inside were camping supplies. A broken stove, some torn clothes, a crushed metal pot. Everything looked like it had been there for a while, maybe a year or two. I looked for ID but found nothing. No name, no wallet. Just the pack and its contents buried under a thin layer of soil. I marked the location on my map and hiked back down to camp with a knot in my stomach. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the fire blazing and my back to the lake. I didn't even go inside the tent. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps again. This time from the ridge side, not the woods. Slow, steady. Then they stopped. I waited. Then I heard something new breathing. Not mine. It was close, just beyond the firelight. I pointed the flashlight toward the sound and clicked it on. Nothing, but the breathing stopped. I stayed frozen, light shaking in my hand, eyes darting across the trees. After a long silence, I heard the sound of something retreating. Not running, just walking slowly into the dark. At dawn, I broke camp. I didn't care how tired I was. I packed everything as fast as I could and hiked back to the Jeep without stopping. The whole way I felt watched. I kept turning around, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was never anything. When I got to the Jeep, I opened the door and was hit with the smell of rot. Something had died nearby. I walked around and found what was left of a deer carcass not 20 feet from where I parked. It had been stripped down to the bones. Not cleanly. Pieces of it were scattered like something or someone had taken their time. I threw my gear into the back, got in, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 2 hours south. I used their phone to call the county sheriff and told them about the buried pack and where to find it. I gave them the coordinates I'd marked and offered to come in and make a full report. They said they'd send someone to check it out. I never heard anything after that. I didn't go back to Harper Lake. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't know who buried that pack or why. But I know what I heard, and I know how it felt. I've camped dozens of times since then, but never alone. Never that far out. And I always bring more than just a knife and bear spray now. Whatever was out there didn't want to be found. And I think I came just close enough to finding it that it wanted me gone. I got the message. It was early September when I decided to take a solo camping trip. The weather was just starting to cool down, especially at night, and I figured it would be the perfect time to get out for a bit. I'd been working long hours and needed to clear my head. I picked a small, lesser-known campground called Black Hollow, tucked deep into the state forest about 3 hours from where I lived. It wasn't a popular place. Most people didn't want to bother with the rough road getting in, and there weren't any real facilities, just a few worn picnic tables, a fire pit here and there, and overgrown trails that didn't always go where they said they would. That was part of the appeal for me. I packed up my gear the night before. A single-man tent, a cold-weather sleeping bag, a basic propane stove, some freeze-dried meals, a couple of water bottles, a filter, and a first aid kit. I also brought my hunting knife and a small hatchet just in case I needed to clear any brush or make kindling. I double-checked my headlamp and backup batteries, filled my backpack, and tied everything down in the back of my truck. I made sure I had a paper map of the area. There was no cell signal out there, and GPS had a bad habit of losing its mind in the forest. The drive out was long but quiet. The highway gave way to back roads, then gravel, then finally dirt. The last hour or so was mostly me bouncing slowly down a rutted forest road lined with tall pines and a mess of tangled undergrowth. I passed a couple of spots where people had obviously camped before. Ash piles, broken branches, and some old fire rings, but no one was around that day. When I finally reached the small clearing near the edge of a ridge, I cut the engine and stepped out. The air smelled like pine needles and earth. Quiet. No traffic. No hum of distant cities. just wind in the trees and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere far off. I set up camp near the edge of the clearing, about 30 feet from the slope that dropped down into the thicker woods. I chose a spot with decent tree cover for shade, but not too thick to block the stars at night. It took me about half an hour to get the tent up, another 15 to collect some dry sticks and get a small fire going. I made one of those bag meals, beef stew I think, and sat by the fire while the sun dropped low. No one else had shown up. I liked it that way. That first night was uneventful. The forest was alive with night sounds. Crickets, the occasional owl, distant rustling. Nothing out of the ordinary. I slept well. The next morning, I woke up early, the sun just coming through the trees. My breath came out in little puffs, the air still cold from the night. I made coffee on the stove, sat on a flat rock, and studied the map. There was a trail that cut behind the ridge and looped around a small creek. The trailhead was a little over a mile east of my campsite. I packed a day bag with water, snacks, a small emergency kit, and my map. I strapped the knife to my belt and headed out. The trail wasn't maintained. I had to duck under fallen limbs and push aside brush more than once. But it was peaceful. I saw deer tracks, a few squirrels, and once I caught sight of a large bird, maybe a hawk, swooping silently overhead. After about an hour and a half, I found the creek. It was shallow, winding through smooth stones and fallen branches. I filtered some water, sat down on a boulder, and took in the quiet. It was on the way back that things started to feel off. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I noticed it. The forest had gone strangely quiet.
No birds.
No bugs, just the sound of my own boots crunching leaves. I stopped to listen. Nothing. That kind of silence isn't normal out there. Forests are never truly quiet unless something's wrong. I kept moving, trying not to let it bother me. But then I realized the trail looked different. I was sure I was following the same path I'd taken out, but there were little things I didn't recognize. A dead tree across the path I didn't remember stepping over. A cluster of strange-looking mushrooms at the base of a stump I hadn't seen before. I pulled out the map again and tried to match what I saw with the terrain around me. It wasn't matching up. I must have taken a wrong turn. I figured I'd keep heading west. Eventually I'd hit the ridge, and from there I could follow it back to my camp. The sun was still high, so I wasn't too worried yet. I kept moving, trying to stay calm, but it wasn't long before the underbrush got thicker. The trees older, twisted, the kind that didn't let much light through. I checked my watch. I'd been walking for almost 3 hours. Way too long. My legs were starting to burn. I hadn't seen the creek again. I hadn't even crossed another trail. Then I saw something ahead. A shape, something low to the ground. As I got closer, I realized it was an old backpack, torn at one corner, the color faded by sun and time. It was lying under a tree, half covered in moss and leaves. I stepped around it, not really wanting to touch it. There were old claw marks on the bark of the tree nearby, deep ones, too wide for a raccoon or anything like that. My skin crawled. I picked up the pace, trying to push through the brush, ignoring the scratches on my arms from branches and thorns. Then I heard it. Not loud, not close, just a single crack, a stick breaking. My head snapped toward the sound, but there was nothing. I stood still for a long time, listening. My ears were ringing from the effort of trying to hear something else. Another crack, closer this time. My heart was pounding. I turned and moved fast. Not quite running, but not walking either. The ground sloped up, uneven, roots and rocks hidden under the layer of leaves. I slipped a couple of times. My hands were dirty. One of my water bottles had come unclipped and was gone. I didn't stop to look for it. I needed to get back. It took another hour of pushing uphill before I reached the top of the ridge. I recognized the shape of the rocks, the way the trees opened up. I was maybe a quarter mile from camp. I didn't stop moving until I was back in the clearing. Everything looked the same. Tent still standing. My gear untouched. The fire ring cold from the night before. But something about it felt different. I lit a fire again, more for comfort than warmth, and made food. As I sat eating, I kept glancing toward the woods. Every sound made me flinch. A squirrel darting through the leaves made me grip my knife. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things. Not loud noises, just faint footsteps, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Every time I sat up and shone my light outside, there was nothing. But I knew something was out there. In the morning, I packed up. I didn't even make coffee. I just wanted to get out. I threw everything in the truck, didn't bother folding the tent properly, and got in. The engine started fine, and I pulled out fast, tires spinning a little in the dirt. I was maybe 15 minutes down the road when I saw something in the ditch. At first I thought it was an animal, but as I got closer, I saw it was a shoe, an old torn hiking boot, half buried in the mud. The laces were still tied. I didn't stop. Back home, I unpacked and checked the map again, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. The trail didn't match what I remembered. I looked up Black Hollow, tried to find stories, reports, anything. There was barely any information, just a few scattered reviews from years ago. One of them mentioned a hiker who'd gone missing nearby in 2012. His name was Aaron. He'd been solo camping. They never found him. I don't know if the backpack I saw was his. I don't know what was following me, but I do know this: something lives out there. Not a ghost or a monster, not something from a storybook. Something real, maybe a person, maybe more than one. People who live in the forest, away from everything. People who watch and wait. I never saw them, but I know they saw me. I never went back. I threw out the map, sold the tent. Now, when I camp, it's in well-known parks with people nearby, bathrooms, ranger stations. It's not the same, but I sleep better. I still think about Black Hollow sometimes, about the silence, about that old boot, about the feeling of being watched by something that didn't want me there. Whatever it was, it let me leave, and I don't plan on giving it another chance. The crackling of the fire echoed through the silent woods, a comforting sound that seemed to dull the growing tension in the air. I had been camping alone for a few days now, trying to escape the noise and stress of everyday life. The plan was simple: find a quiet spot in the forest, pitch my tent, and spend some time disconnecting from the world. It had been peaceful at first, the rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of birds, and the gentle hum of the wind all adding to the serene atmosphere. But something had changed. The woods felt different now. It was the fourth night of my solo trip. The fire had burned down to a small pile of glowing embers, casting long shadows across the clearing. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, shivering slightly despite the warmth of the fire. The sky above was a deep, dark blue, the stars barely visible through the thick canopy of trees. I had always loved the quiet of the forest at night. There was something soothing about it, the way the world seemed to hold its breath while everything around me went to sleep. But tonight was different. I had heard something earlier. At first, I dismissed it as the wind or some small animal moving through the underbrush. But then it happened again. A faint rustling, followed by the distinct sound of twigs snapping underfoot. It was too deliberate to be an animal. I stood up and scanned the shadows, but there was nothing there, just the flickering light of the fire and the dense trees around me. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks, but the unease lingered. The feeling didn't go away. In fact, it only grew stronger as the night wore on. Every crackle of the fire seemed to echo in my ears, every rustle of leaves too loud and too close. I kept my eyes trained on the darkness, watching for any movement. I had been in the woods enough to know that things didn't always feel right at night, but this was different. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I had made the decision earlier that day to stay at this spot for the night, and I wasn't about to let a few strange noises send me running. I'd been in worse situations before, so I pushed the fear down, convinced it was just my mind playing tricks, and turned back to my tent, trying to ignore the sense of unease crawling up my spine. It was then that I heard it again, a faint rustling, but this time it was closer, much closer. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, staring into the shadows, waiting for whatever it was to reveal itself. There was nothing, just the wind, the trees, and the fire. I couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. It wasn't just the noise, it was the silence afterward. No birds, no animals, nothing. The usual hum of the forest had gone eerily still. The air felt thicker, heavier, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Maybe I was just overreacting. I had been alone for too long, and the isolation was starting to get to me. I convinced myself that it was nothing more than a deer or a raccoon, just another animal moving through the forest. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I grabbed my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, and walked around the camp, checking the perimeter. There was no sign of anything unusual. No footprints, no broken branches, no movement. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I kept scanning the trees, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, expecting something to jump out at me at any moment. The hours dragged on, and the unease refused to dissipate. I decided to crawl into my tent, hoping that the enclosed space would offer some comfort, some semblance of safety. But even inside, the feeling didn't leave. I kept hearing things, subtle noises, like footsteps in the distance or the sound of leaves brushing together. They came and went, but they never stopped. The silence would settle in for a moment, only to be broken by another faint rustle or snap of a twig. It was as though something was moving just beyond the edge of the light, staying just out of view. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. My mind was racing, my pulse quickening with every sound I heard outside. My tent felt small and flimsy, like it wouldn't stand a chance if whatever was out there decided to approach. The wind howled through the trees, and the fire outside had burned down to embers. I shivered in the dark, wrapped in my sleeping bag, trying to tell myself that it was just the forest doing what the forest does. Animals moving, the wind shifting. Nothing to be afraid of. But then I heard it. A voice, or what I thought was a voice. It was faint, barely audible above the sound of the wind, but it was there. A soft, low murmur, like someone speaking just beyond the trees. My heart jumped into my throat. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the voice was gone as quickly as it had come. I lay perfectly still, waiting, hoping it was nothing more than my imagination. But the silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I had no idea how much time had passed since I'd first heard that strange noise. It felt like the night had stretched on forever, the hours blending together into one endless, oppressive moment. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone out there? Was it just another hiker, lost like me? Or was it something else? I couldn't shake the thought that whatever it wasn't just a passerby. I finally decided to leave the tent and check once more, hoping that if I confronted whatever was out there, I could put my mind at ease. My flashlight flickered as I stepped outside, and the cold air hit me like a slap in the face. I turned the beam toward the trees, sweeping it back and forth, but there was nothing there. No movement, no shapes, no signs of life. But then I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the dirt, just a few feet away from my tent. They were fresh, the edges of the prints still sharp, as if someone had walked by recently. My stomach dropped. I had been careful to check the area when I set up camp. There had been no tracks, no signs of anyone else being here. I crouched down, inspecting the prints closely. They were large, heavy, the kind of prints someone would leave if they were wearing boots. But there was no other sign of life, no evidence of a person. It didn't make sense. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The unease was now full-blown fear. Whoever had been out here wasn't just passing through. They were watching me. The realization settled in, and with it came the overwhelming urge to get out of the woods. I packed up as quickly as I could, stuffing my things into my backpack and pulling the tent down with shaking hands. Every rustle of the trees, every creak of the wood around me, made me jump. It felt like I wasn't alone anymore, like someone was just waiting for me to make a mistake. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my bag and started walking, heading back down the path I had come from. The flashlight bounced erratically in my hand, my feet stumbling over roots and rocks in the darkness. The path was narrow and uneven, and I cursed myself for not being more prepared. The quiet of the woods was suffocating, and every sound, every creak of a branch, felt like a threat. I kept walking, my mind racing, my breath coming in short gasps. I had to get to safety. I couldn't be out here alone anymore. The thought of returning to my camp, of being anywhere near that spot, filled me with terror. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, I reached the main road. My car was parked not far from the trailhead, and I practically ran toward it, my legs burning with exhaustion. I fumbled for my keys, hands slick with sweat, and when I finally opened the door and slid inside, I locked it behind me with a sigh of relief. I drove away, my eyes constantly scanning the road behind me, half expecting to see someone following. But there was nothing. The woods, the camp, the strange footprints, they were all behind me now. I had escaped. The fear that had gripped me for so long started to ebb away as the headlights illuminated the dark road ahead. I didn't know what had happened out there, what had been watching me, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. The woods would remain a mystery, a place where I had ventured too far into the unknown. I was glad to leave it behind, but the image of those footprints would stay with me forever, a reminder of just how close I had come to something I couldn't understand. I was 34 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in late September. I'd been feeling burnt out from work, tired of the city, and worn down by the noise and the people. I wasn't running from anything major, just the usual stuff: emails, phone calls, traffic, people cutting in line, meetings that could have been messages. I wanted quiet. I wanted to feel small in the middle of nowhere. I hadn't done a solo trip in years, not since I was in my 20s, but I used to go a lot when I was younger and had less to worry about. I picked a place that wasn't far from home, maybe 3 hours driving. It was in upstate New York, a state forest area, not a national park, which meant fewer people and less structure. No marked campsites, no rangers making the rounds. You parked at a small gravel lot at the edge of the forest, walked your gear in, and camped where you wanted. I liked that kind of freedom, felt more real, more raw. I packed light but carefully. I brought my tent, a small single-man setup I'd used before. I had a sleeping bag good down to 30 degrees, a lightweight stove, freeze-dried food packets, protein bars, a water filter, a small first aid kit, a headlamp, a multi-tool, a bear canister, and a few changes of clothes. I didn't bring anything fancy, just what I needed. I had a paper map, too. I always carry one even though I use GPS. Phones die. Batteries don't last in cold weather. I got there around noon on a Friday. The sky was gray but not threatening. A chill hung in the air, the kind that makes your breath curl when you exhale. I parked in the lot, which was empty except for one old Subaru with out-of-state plates. The car looked like it had been there a while. The windshield had a smear of fallen leaves stuck in the corners, and the tires looked a bit sunken, like maybe they'd lost some air. I didn't think much of it. People leave cars for days when they're hiking long trails. I shouldered my pack, locked my car, and started walking. I followed a faded trail for a while, then veered off when I found a small clearing near a narrow creek. It was far enough from the parking lot that I felt alone, but not so far that I'd get lost. I marked a few trees with small bits of orange tape just in case. The spot was quiet. The only sounds were the slow bubbling of the creek and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I set up my tent, gathered some dry twigs for a small fire, and boiled water for lunch. I sat on a flat rock while I ate, just watching the trees sway. That first day was peaceful. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear any voices. No cars, no dogs barking, nothing. Just the forest. That night, the wind picked up. I could hear it pushing through the trees, rattling branches. I heard the occasional thud of something heavy falling. A dead limb maybe, or a pine cone. Normal forest noises. I didn't sleep much, though. The wind made the tent flap and creak, and every time I started to drift off, something new would snap or rustle. Around 3 a.m., I got up and stepped outside to pee. The air was freezing. My breath fogged in front of my face, and the moonlight filtered through the trees in long, pale lines. I stood there for a minute, just listening. That's when I heard something. It was faint, distant, not an animal, not the wind. It sounded like metal clanging, soft but deliberate, like someone hitting two pipes together. Once, then again, then silence. I froze. I strained to hear more, but the wind picked up again and drowned out everything else. I told myself it could be a tree creaking just right, maybe a rock falling against another rock, or maybe someone nearby working on something. People do weird things. I went back in the tent and zipped it up tight. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I decided to explore a bit. I followed the creek upstream, walking for maybe 2 miles. The forest was dense, but walkable. I found animal tracks in the mud, deer mostly, maybe a raccoon. Nothing unusual. I kept moving until I found another clearing, smaller than mine. In the middle of it was a fire ring, a crude circle of rocks with blackened ash inside. Fresh, still slightly warm when I touched it. Someone had been there recently. There were no tents, no gear, nothing else. Just the fire ring and a broken tree branch that looked like someone had used it to stir the coals. I looked around but didn't see anyone. I called out once, just to make sure I wasn't about to walk into someone's camp. No answer. I waited for a few minutes. Still nothing. I walked back to my own camp faster than I'd come. Something about that place felt wrong. Not scary exactly, just off, like I was intruding. I didn't like that the fire was still warm. That meant someone had been there this morning. And if they were nearby, they'd heard me, maybe seen me. That evening, I didn't light a fire. I cooked with the stove inside the tent vestibule and kept the light low. I listened hard. I kept checking behind me, scanning the trees. Nothing. No voices, no movement. Just wind and rustling and the occasional snap from the woods. I forced myself to eat. I forced myself to act normal. That night, the sound came again. The metal clanging. Closer this time. It came from the direction of that second clearing. The same slow rhythm. Clang, clang, pause. I didn't move. I didn't even unzip the sleeping bag. I lay there, stiff and silent, trying not to breathe loud. It stopped after maybe 5 minutes. The next morning, I thought about packing up, but I told myself I was overreacting. It was probably a hunter marking a trail, or some hiker with weird gear. I'd never heard of anything bad happening in these woods. The forest was quiet again. Still, it almost felt peaceful, until I noticed the scratch on one of the trees near my tent. It was fresh, a long vertical scrape, deep and clean, not made by an animal, not from a branch falling. It was low to the ground, about waist height, and it went down a few inches into the bark, like someone had dragged a knife or a blade against it. I started noticing more after that. A second scrape higher up, a pile of small stones stacked in a triangle a few feet from the creek. A piece of twine hanging from a branch, frayed and dangling like it had been cut. None of it was there when I set up camp. I was sure of it. I didn't cook anything that night. I didn't eat. I stayed in the tent with my light off and listened. Hours passed. The forest shifted from dusk to pitch black. I heard owls, wind, leaves. Then the clang again. Closer. I didn't move. Then footsteps. Not animal. Not light. Slow, crunching footfalls on dry leaves. Approaching. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. The steps stopped. Right outside. Then nothing. No noise. Just silence. I waited. 10 minutes. 20. Still nothing. Then I heard the steps again, moving away. Slowly. Fading into the distance. I didn't sleep. I didn't move until sunrise. When the light finally came through the thin walls of my tent, I got up and looked around.
No footprints.
No signs, but something was different. My bear canister had been moved. Not far, just a few feet from where I'd left it. It was sealed, but sitting upright now, when I always left it on its side. That was enough. I packed everything up in under 15 minutes. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted out. I double-checked the map, oriented myself, and started walking. I didn't take the path I came in on. I tried to take a shorter route back, one that cut diagonally toward the road. It was stupid. I knew better, but I was panicking, and I just wanted to get to the car. After half an hour, I realized I was lost. The terrain didn't match the map. I wasn't sure where I'd veered off. I backtracked, tried to follow the creek, but I must have gone the wrong way. I couldn't find my markers. That's when I heard the clang again. Farther away, but still too close. I ran. I didn't care about noise. I just ran in the opposite direction. I tripped, got up, kept running. I didn't stop until I found a fallen log I recognized from the first day. I followed that, breathless, until I saw the gravel lot. My car was there. So was the Subaru. Only now, the back hatch of the Subaru was open. Inside, there were camping supplies, an old tent, a rusted axe, empty water jugs. But the thing that stopped me cold was the pile of metal rods lying on a tarp. Long, thin pipes, the kind that would clang if you hit them together. I didn't wait. I got in my car and drove. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station on the interstate. I went inside, locked the door of the bathroom, and sat on the floor for 10 minutes just breathing. I never reported anything. I didn't have a name, didn't see a face. I didn't have proof. Just strange noises, small signs, and a bad feeling that could have been anything. I told myself maybe the Subaru belonged to someone who got picked up by a friend. Maybe the clanging was wind hitting some old gear. Maybe I imagined the footsteps. But I know I didn't. I don't go into unmarked woods anymore. I don't camp alone. I didn't think I would regret this trip. I've always been one for the outdoors, and a weekend camping in the woods with a couple of friends seemed like a great way to unwind. We'd been planning it for weeks, picking the perfect site far away from the usual crowded camping grounds. I had no idea then that this trip would turn into something I would never forget, and not for any of the reasons I expected. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The site was isolated just as we'd hoped. There wasn't another soul around for miles, and the quiet seemed oddly peaceful. We set up camp quickly, each of us splitting up the duties, pitching the tents, gathering firewood, setting up the cooler. It was all pretty standard stuff. The woods felt thick around us, the kind of place where the trees were so close you almost felt enclosed. The air smelled fresh and clean, almost too fresh, like something was waiting. But I didn't think much of it then. The night fell quickly, and we gathered around the fire. We were quiet for a while, just watching the flames flicker and crackle, the sound of the woods surrounding us. It wasn't uncomfortable, but there was something about the stillness that felt wrong. Not exactly threatening, but strange. I kept brushing it off, thinking it was just my imagination. I didn't want to ruin the mood. But as the hours stretched on and the fire died down to a smolder, I started to feel off. I can't really explain it. It wasn't anything specific. No noises that I could pin down, no visible threat. But there was this tension, an energy in the air that seemed to grow heavier as the night went on. I had a strong urge to look over my shoulder, to check the trees, but I didn't. I tried to focus on the conversation, but my mind kept wandering. I kept thinking I saw things moving in the corner of my eyes, something shifting between the trees. But each time I looked, there was nothing there. My friend Ethan, who was sitting next to me, must have sensed I was getting jumpy. He laughed and tossed a log onto the fire. "It's just your mind playing tricks," he said, though it wasn't clear if he was talking to me or just making an observation about the dark woods around us. I nodded, forcing a smile, but deep down, something didn't sit right with me. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling only grew as the night wore on. It wasn't the kind of fear you feel when you're being watched by something obvious, like a predator. No, it was something subtler, a slow build of unease that crept under your skin, making your senses feel like they were on high alert for no reason. At some point, we decided to hit the sack. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to settle into the sleeping bag. The ground was hard, and the cold air crept in through the thin fabric of the tent, making sleep difficult. The rustling of the trees above seemed louder now, the wind picking up a bit. I tried to focus on the sounds, nothing unnatural, but the quiet that followed was just too still, too deep. My thoughts started to spiral. I could hear Ethan snoring from the other tent. It sounded peaceful enough, but it only made my unease grow. The rustling of the trees outside felt louder, more urgent, like the forest was trying to tell me something. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, eyes wide open, listening. The wind had stopped now. All I could hear was the occasional crack of a twig underfoot and the soft hum of my breath. The night seemed like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then I heard something else, a distant, faint sound like footsteps. But they weren't the footsteps of animals. No, these were too rhythmic, too heavy to be anything like that. I held my breath, straining to listen. They were slow, deliberate, and definitely human. I could feel my heart race, the fear building in the pit of my stomach. I had to be imagining it. I tried to tell myself that, but the sound was too consistent. The crunch of leaves, the snap of branches. It was close, closer than I was comfortable with. I lay still, hardly daring to breathe, waiting for the sound to stop or fade away. Didn't. I tried to gather my thoughts. Was it one of my friends? Had they gotten up? No, the sound was wrong. It wasn't from the campsite. It was too far away to be anyone from our group. The footsteps were coming from deeper in the woods, moving between the trees. What struck me then was how silent everything else had become. The wind had stopped. The crickets had stopped chirping. Everything was still, unnaturally still. It felt as though the forest itself had gone quiet, as if something was listening too. I waited, holding my breath, listening intently. The steps were getting closer. Whoever or whatever was out there, they were moving with purpose. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I wasn't alone. The sound stopped suddenly, dead in its tracks. For a few moments, all I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears. My hands were clammy, my body frozen in fear. Was it watching me? I couldn't move, couldn't think of anything to do. I wanted to call out, to get my friend's attention, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. Then it started again. The steps, slow and deliberate, closing the distance. I could feel it now, right outside my tent, hovering in the space between the fabric and the dark woods. My pulse thundered in my chest, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. What did I do now? Without thinking, I unzipped the tent slowly, careful not to make any noise. The air was cold, and the world outside looked like a black void. The trees loomed overhead, their thick branches blocking out most of the stars. The only sound was my breathing and the faint crackling from the fire, barely visible in the distance. I crept out of the tent, trying to make myself as small as possible. My eyes darted around, scanning the dark shapes of the trees, searching for any movement. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then, a shadow flickered between the trunks, just beyond the firelight. My stomach dropped. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was definitely human. It was tall, too tall to be one of my friends. I could barely make out its form, but it was moving, slow and careful, like it was searching for something or someone. I backed away, taking slow, measured steps, my mind racing. My heart hammered in my chest, and the darkness felt oppressive, suffocating. It didn't move toward the campfire or the tents. Instead, it veered off, heading deeper into the woods. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from the shadow moving further into the trees. Minutes felt like hours, and then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the shadow vanished into the dark. The woods were silent once again. No footsteps, no rustling, just that crushing silence. I could still feel the presence, though. It was like the air itself had changed, the atmosphere heavy with something unspoken, like the forest was holding its breath along with me. I didn't waste another second. I ran back to my tent, scrambling to zip it up, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the dark woods around me. I lay there in the quiet, shaking, unsure of what to do next. I could hear my friends stirring in their tents. The night had returned to its eerie silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. As dawn finally broke, the first rays of sunlight pierced the trees. The forest seemed to exhale with me, the weight lifting just a little. I could hear the birds again, the wind gently moving the branches. But the unease stayed with me, I didn't tell my friends about what I saw that night, but I knew we wouldn't be staying another night in that forest. We packed up and left at the first opportunity, not looking back once. I never went camping in those woods again, and for good reason. I've thought about that night more times than I care to admit, trying to make sense of it, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone out there. The sun had already sunk low behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the campsite. The night was cool, the fire crackling softly as the flames licked the logs and sent faint embers into the air. I sat on the log near the fire, the familiar scent of pine needles and damp earth filling the cool evening air. It was just me and the wilderness. The idea of a solo camping trip had always seemed appealing. Peace, quiet, and a break from the world. I'd done it before, but something felt different this time. I had picked a secluded spot deep in the woods, far from any trail or campsite. The nearest town was miles away, and I hadn't seen another person since I turned off the main road hours earlier. That was the appeal, getting away from it all. But now, as the light faded and the shadows deepened, I began to feel uneasy. Maybe it was the quiet, the kind of silence you only get in the deep woods, where not even a breeze stirs the leaves. Or maybe it was the way the trees seemed to loom around me, stretching their dark branches high into the night sky like bony fingers. There was no sound, except for the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of something moving in the underbrush. I shrugged it off at first, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of being so isolated. I hadn't seen a single sign of wildlife. No birds, no squirrels, no insects buzzing around the fire. It wasn't completely unusual, but it felt wrong. Like everything around me was holding its breath, waiting for something. I tried to ignore it, pulling my jacket tighter around me as the temperature dropped further. As the hours passed, I kept the fire going, adding logs to keep the flames alive. The orange glow flickered against the surrounding trees, casting eerie shadows that danced in the periphery of my vision. I told myself that I was fine, that I was just being paranoid. I checked my watch, 11:30 p.m. Time seemed to drag on in the quiet darkness, but eventually, I decided to turn in for the night. The tent was set up not far from the fire, just out of its reach. I knew the fire would eventually die down, and I wanted to be able to sleep without the heat from the flames. The thought of crawling into my sleeping bag and closing my eyes should have been comforting. But as I lay there in the dark, the stillness felt oppressive. I pulled the zipper on my tent a little higher, cocooning myself in the fabric. The sounds of the forest outside were distant, like they were muffled by some invisible barrier. Then I heard it, a faint rustling noise, the kind of sound you hear when someone steps on dry leaves or cracks a twig underfoot. It was coming from outside the tent. My heart thudded in my chest. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe I'd imagined it. But then it came again, this time closer. I was frozen. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Could be an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But the sound didn't fit. It was too deliberate, too slow. Whoever or whatever was outside was moving with purpose, not like an animal trying to find food. I reached for the flashlight in the pocket of my jacket and switched it on, casting a pale beam of light across the tent. The rustling stopped again, and for a moment, everything was still. I lay there, holding the flashlight close to my chest, trying to steady my breathing. The minutes ticked by like hours, each one stretching out longer than the last. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal. I'd been hearing things. But then, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, there was a sound, a whisper, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. It wasn't in my head, it was outside, right by the tent. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. It was low, almost guttural, like something trying to speak without really understanding the words. I sat up suddenly, the flashlight in my hand shaking. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from, but it seemed to be moving around the tent, circling it. I held my breath, waiting, hoping whatever it was would move on. Didn't. The rustling started again, Closer this time, just outside the tent wall. I heard the crunch of dry leaves and twigs, followed by the sound of something brushing against the fabric. It was like someone or something was pressing their face against the tent. I could almost feel the pressure against the walls, the subtle shifts of weight as it moved. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. I could only lie there, paralyzed, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't just stay there and wait. Slowly, I reached for my boots, trying to make as little noise as possible. I needed to get out of the tent, away from whatever was out there. But before I could make a move, the rustling stopped. The silence was deafening. I strained my ears, hoping for any sound, anything that might tell me what was happening. Then came a sharp, sudden crack, like a branch snapping under the weight of something heavy. I jumped, my heart racing. The fire had died down to just embers, but the shadows from the trees still stretched long and dark, creeping into the edges of my vision. I couldn't see anything beyond the tent, but I knew something was out there. I couldn't wait any longer. With shaking hands, I unzipped the tent door just enough to slip out. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, but I barely registered it. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The forest was as still as a tomb. I stayed low to the ground, creeping toward the fire pit. The embers were still glowing, casting a faint light that barely touched the trees around me. The woods were impossibly quiet. No crickets, no owls, no wind. Nothing. I grabbed a long branch from the pile of firewood and held it in front of me like a makeshift weapon, my heart pounding in my ears. I stood there for a moment, trying to gather my bearings. There was no sign of anyone or anything, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. The forest felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but everything seemed off, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I glanced back at the tent, my mind racing with possibilities. Who or what had been outside? Was it someone playing a prank? Or was it something more? My instincts told me that whatever it wasn't human. It felt too deliberate, too calculated. I spent the next hour watching the trees, listening for any movement, any sound that might give me a clue about what was going on. But nothing came, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional snap of twigs in the distance. It was maddening. By the time the sky started to lighten with the first hint of dawn, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay there another minute. Whatever had been outside that tent, circling me, it wasn't over. It had only been waiting for the right moment, and I wasn't going to give it that moment. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, barely taking the time to fold everything properly. My hands were shaking, my mind still racing. I didn't care about anything except getting out of there. I didn't even bother to put out the fire, just grabbed my gear, shoved it into my backpack, and ran. As I hiked back to the main road, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, just out of view, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When I finally reached my car, I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. I started the engine without hesitation, the sound of the engine almost deafening in the quiet morning. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in those woods, that something had been there, and it wasn't finished. I didn't go camping again after that, and every time I hear a branch snap in the woods, my skin still crawls. Something in those woods was watching me, waiting, and I still wonder what it wanted. It's funny how quickly the woods can go from being calm and peaceful to something so unsettling. I had always enjoyed camping, the quiet of the forest, the feeling of being away from the noise of the world. But that trip, that weekend in the woods, changed my perspective entirely. I had planned the trip with a couple of friends. A weekend out in the middle of nowhere, just us, some tents, and the wilderness. No phones, no distractions, just nature. We chose a spot that was remote enough that we wouldn't have to deal with other campers. A little clearing near a small creek, surrounded by thick trees and hills in the distance. We arrived on Friday afternoon, after a long drive up a winding dirt road. The kind of road where every turn feels like it might lead you somewhere completely different. It was still light out when we set up camp. We picked a spot near the creek, where we could hear the water running over rocks. It was peaceful, calm, the perfect place to get away from everything. I helped set up the tents and gather firewood while my friends worked on getting the campfire started. The night was typical for a camping trip. We made a simple dinner over the fire, hot dogs and beans, and talked about everything and nothing. The stars above us were bright, and the sound of the fire crackling was soothing. It was easy to forget that we were in the middle of a forest, miles away from civilization. Everything felt safe, and I felt relaxed, at least at first. It was around 10:30 when things started to feel off. It wasn't anything big at first, just a feeling. One of my friends, Jake, had gone to bed early, complaining that he was tired. The rest of us stayed by the fire, roasting marshmallows and talking quietly. That's when I noticed something. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the firelight, but then I realized that there was a figure standing just beyond the tree-line. I had only caught a glimpse of it, but it was enough to make my stomach twist. It was tall, maybe 6 or 7 feet, and it was standing perfectly still. I thought it might be another camper, maybe someone who had lost their way. But there was something off about the way it stood. It wasn't moving, not even the slightest. It was as if it was frozen in place, watching us. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that it was nothing. Maybe it was just a deer or some other animal. But then I saw it again, clearer this time, just at the edge of the trees. The figure hadn't moved, but it was different. The more I stared at it, the more wrong it seemed. I'm not the type to get scared easily. I've been camping for years, and I've dealt with my share of wild animals, strange noises, and the like. But something about that figure didn't sit right with me. I glanced over at my friends, but none of them seemed to have noticed. I debated saying something, but I didn't want to freak them out. So I stayed quiet, hoping that whatever it was would go away. But it didn't. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as the night went on. The figure remained, standing motionless at the edge of the woods. At one point, I could have sworn I saw it shift just a little, but when I looked again, it was still in the same spot. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us, that it knew we were there, and it was waiting. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, trying to act casual, and walked over to where the figure had been. The ground was soft, covered with fallen leaves, and the air was cool and still. But when I reached the edge of the trees, there was nothing. No figure, no sign of anything out of the ordinary, just darkness. I returned to the campfire, trying to mask the unease I felt, but my heart was pounding in my chest. It didn't make sense. Maybe I had imagined it. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in my gut. Something was wrong. We stayed by the fire for another hour or so before calling it a night. Jake was already asleep, and the rest of us slowly retreated to our tents. I didn't sleep well. Every little noise outside, every rustle in the trees, kept me on edge. I kept thinking about that figure. Why hadn't I heard it moving? Why had it been so still, so unnatural? I woke up early the next morning, just before the sun came up. I unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cool morning air. The forest was quiet, still, like nothing had happened the night before. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was like I was being watched, like there was something lurking just beyond my vision. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the remnants of a bad dream. The others woke up a little later, and we spent the day hiking through the woods. The sun was out, and everything seemed normal, peaceful even. But I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, wondering if that figure would appear again. By late afternoon, we were back at camp, tired from the hike but feeling good. We made another fire, cooked dinner, and started talking about plans for the next day. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. The air felt heavier, the silence more pronounced. And once again, I saw it, just at the edge of the trees. The figure was back. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I pointed it out to the others, but when they looked, there was nothing there. Just the same empty forest. They laughed it off, telling me I was imagining things. But I knew what I had seen. It was standing there watching us, waiting. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just a tall, dark silhouette standing motionless in the trees. I felt a growing sense of dread, like something bad was about to happen. I kept my eyes on the figure, refusing to look away. I didn't want to take my eyes off it in case it disappeared again. But after what felt like an eternity, the figure finally moved. It wasn't fast, but it was deliberate. It stepped forward, slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural. I could see its outline more clearly now, its long arms and long legs, the way it moved with an almost mechanical stiffness. It wasn't human. I could feel my heart racing as I backed away from the fire, stepping towards the tent. My friends didn't notice, still talking and laughing around the fire. But I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It was coming closer now, moving steadily through the trees. It wasn't trying to hide. It was just walking, like it had all the time in the world. I could hear the rustling of leaves, the sound of its feet crushing twigs beneath it. But there was no sense of urgency, no rush, just a slow, deliberate pace. I backed into the tent, my heart pounding in my chest. I zipped the flap shut and tried to steady my breathing. I could hear the figure outside now, its footsteps growing louder. It wasn't stopping, wasn't hesitating. It was coming for us. I spent the night awake, listening to the sounds of the forest. The figure never came closer, but I could hear it moving in the woods, circling our camp. The sound of its footsteps was constant, like it was waiting for something, or maybe just watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted. In the morning, I convinced my friends to pack up early. They hadn't seen the figure, hadn't felt what I had felt, but they could sense that something was wrong. We didn't waste any time. We packed our things quickly, not saying much. No one wanted to stick around to find out what that thing was. As we left the camp, I looked back one last time. The figure was gone. The woods were quiet again, but I knew that whatever it was still out there, waiting. And I wasn't sure if I ever wanted to return. I haven't been camping since that weekend. The woods are different now, darker somehow. And every time I think about going back, that feeling in my gut comes rushing back. I don't know what I saw, and I don't ever want to find out again. It's one of those weekends where everything just lines up perfectly. The weather's just right, not too hot, not too cold, and I finally managed to get away from the chaos of work and the stress of the city. My friends and I had been planning this camping trip for a while, and it felt like the perfect opportunity to unwind. We chose a remote spot up in the mountains, a place we'd heard about from a buddy who'd been there once but never fully explained why it was so special. That was fine by me. I was just looking for some peace and quiet, a break from the daily grind. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the trees. The campsite was nestled beside a creek that ran through the forest, the sound of the water making everything feel peaceful and calm. I set up my tent quickly, grateful to be away from the noise of the world for a while. The other guys were already gathering wood for a fire, and soon enough, the camp was alive with the flicker of flames, the smell of wood smoke, and the chatter of excited voices. We cracked open a few beers, laughed about nothing in particular, and started to settle into the rhythm of the evening. The forest around us was dense, the trees towering high and blocking out most of the remaining light from the sunset. The place felt like it was tucked away in a forgotten part of the world, far enough from the hustle and bustle of any city that it felt like we were in our own little corner of the universe. It was peaceful in a way that made me feel like I could breathe easier. A weight I didn't even realize I'd been carrying just lifted from my chest. Nightfall came quickly, and with it, the temperature dropped. We all huddled around the fire, adding logs to keep it blazing, but the chill started creeping in from all sides. A few of the guys joked about how they should have packed heavier jackets, but the cold didn't bother me too much. The fire was enough to keep me warm for now. It wasn't until later, when everyone else had gone to bed and I was alone by the fire, that I started to feel that strange sense of unease. The woods were too quiet now, almost unnaturally so. The normal sounds you'd expect from a forest, night birds, rustling animals, the occasional snap of a branch, were absent. It was like the forest had gone silent, and with it, my mind started to play tricks on me. I tried to shrug it off, assuming it was just my imagination running wild. The woods were big and unfamiliar, and I was probably just overthinking things. Still, there was a weird feeling in the air, something I couldn't put my finger on. The shadows seemed darker now, like they were pressing in around me. I kept telling myself that it was just the night, that it was normal to feel a little nervous when you're out in the wilderness. But as I sat there, the feeling wouldn't go away. The crackling fire was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay, but even it seemed to be fading, the logs starting to burn down to embers. I threw a few more logs onto the fire, trying to keep it going, but something in the woods beyond the light made me feel like I wasn't alone. I glanced around, but all I could see were the outlines of trees against the starry sky, their branches moving slightly in the breeze. Still, that nagging feeling stuck with me. I wasn't sure what made me decide to go for a walk, but something in me told me I needed to stretch my legs. Maybe it was just a way to shake off the weird tension I was feeling. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way down the narrow path that led deeper into the forest. The light from the flashlight barely cut through the thick underbrush, but I walked anyway, hoping it would help me clear my head. The deeper I went, the more the woods seemed to close in around me. The trees were so thick now, their trunks wide and gnarled, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. It felt like the path was narrowing, like I was heading further into some dark, forgotten place where no one had set foot in years. I could hear the distant sound of the creek, but it sounded muffled now, almost like it was coming from far off. I stopped walking for a moment, listening. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling in the leaves, too quiet to be the wind, too deliberate to be an animal. It was coming from my right, deeper into the woods. My heart skipped a beat, but I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was just some animal moving through the underbrush. But then I heard it again, this time closer. I turned my head quickly, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. The beam danced across the trees, the ground, but nothing looked out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something just beyond the light. I took a step forward, my pulse racing now, but then I froze. A figure, a dark shape, moved just outside the edge of the flashlight's beam. It was only a split second, but it was enough for my stomach to drop. I called out, my voice shaking slightly, "Hello!" No answer. The rustling had stopped. I stood there for a long moment, waiting for something, anything to give me a reason to believe it was just a deer or another animal. But nothing came. My gut was telling me to get back to camp, to leave the woods and that eerie silence behind. So, I turned around and started walking back quickly, my breath coming faster now, my senses on high alert. As I made my way back, I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone anymore. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every step I took seemed to echo in the quiet woods. My flashlight flickered, and I stopped to check the batteries. They were fine, but the beam seemed weaker somehow, like it couldn't cut through the dark as it had before. It wasn't long before I started hearing things again. Footsteps, following mine, keeping pace with me from behind. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, slow and deliberate. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the trees and the dark, endless forest stretching out before me. I started walking faster, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were right behind me now, too close. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps as I picked up my pace to a jog. The forest was no longer a peaceful place. It felt alive, watching, waiting. By the time I made it back to the campsite, I was practically running. I burst into the clearing, my eyes wide, scanning the shadows. The campfire was still burning, but everyone else was asleep, their tents quiet and still. I grabbed my things, threw them in my bag, and stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't sleep that night, not a wink. The entire time, I kept hearing those footsteps, even as I sat there by the fire, even as the hours passed. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something had been out there with me. Something had been watching. The next morning, I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. I just packed my stuff quietly, keeping my eyes on the woods, and made sure to leave as soon as possible. The others were all too eager to move on, and we ended up heading back to the nearest town. I could still feel the weight of the forest pressing in on me as we drove away, the woods growing smaller in the rearview mirror. I haven't gone back to that place. I'm not sure why I was so drawn to it in the first place, but after that night, I've never had the urge to return. It wasn't just the isolation of the woods. It was the feeling that someone had been out there with me, something that didn't want me there, and that's the part one can't shake. Whatever it was, it didn't want me to leave. It's late summer, the kind of evening where the temperature falls but doesn't make you feel cold. The last bit of light from the sun lingers behind the trees, and you can hear the crickets start up their song as the shadows stretch across the campsite. I'm sitting by the fire, the crackling of burning with the only sound beside the occasional rustling from the forest around me. It's peaceful, almost calming. I've been camping for years, and this spot, tucked deep in the woods, has always felt like the perfect escape. It's isolated, no roads nearby, just me and the trees and the stars overhead. I'm here alone this time, no group of friends, no family, just me. I've come up to this same spot many times before to get away from the hustle of everyday life. The campsite is set up in a small clearing, with a fire pit dug into the ground and a few large rocks surrounding it. There's a tent pitched on one side of the clearing, my gear neatly stowed inside. I've got food and water for a few days, a first aid kit, and the usual camping tools. It's quiet, too quiet. I've gotten used to the silence of the woods over the years, but tonight, it feels different. It's hard to explain, just a nagging feeling that something isn't quite right. Maybe it's the fact that I'm alone this time. Maybe it's the sound of branches snapping somewhere off in the distance, when there should be nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves. I stand up and stretch, feeling the ache in my back from the long hike earlier. It had taken me hours to reach this spot, but the effort had been worth it. The view from the clearing is worth the sweat and muscle strain. The landscape around me is wild, untamed, and beautiful. The trees rise up on all sides, their leaves whispering in the wind. The mountains are visible in the distance, their peaks bathed in the last of the sunlight. I grab the flashlight from my pack and shine it around the clearing. The beam cuts through the darkness, illuminating the trees at the edge of the campsite. Everything looks normal. The fire crackles, sending occasional sparks into the air, but the woods themselves seem still, too still. I sit back down by the fire and stoke it, adding a few more logs to keep the flames high. There's something about firelight that feels safe, almost protective. It's familiar, something we've relied on for thousands of years. I'm not sure why, but the fire gives me a sense of comfort in a place that's supposed to be peaceful, but feels oddly tense tonight. As the night wears on, I start to feel it, the tension, the unease. I try to shake it off, telling myself it's just the quiet playing tricks on me. I've been alone in the woods before. I know how it can mess with your mind, how the sounds of nature can start to feel a little too close, a little too loud. I remind myself that nothing is out of the ordinary, that it's just me and the trees and the fire. But then I hear it. At first, it's so faint I think it's my imagination. A soft sound coming from the woods behind me. I stop moving, holding my breath, trying to listen closer. It's a crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. It's not close, but it's not far off either. My heart skips a beat. It's too dark to see anything, but I get the feeling that something's out there, something or someone, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I tell myself it's just an animal. Deer maybe a raccoon or something smaller. But the sound comes again, a little closer this time, like whatever it is moving through the trees, deliberately making noise. I get up, my feet shuffling on the dirt, and I grab the flashlight again, shining it into the darkness. The beam flickers across the trees, but nothing is there. I don't know why, but I feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Stupid, I know. It's just the woods. But the sound of something moving out there, out of sight, makes me uneasy. I check the fire, making sure the logs are stable, and sit back down, keeping the flashlight close in case I need it. The night stretches on, and the feeling of being watched intensifies. I try to ignore it. I try to tell myself it's nothing. It's just the wind, the branches moving in the breeze, the occasional animal on the prowl. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. I decide to go for a walk. Maybe it'll clear my head. I take a few steps away from the fire, keeping the light in my hand and shining it ahead of me. The woods are quiet, save for the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. The beam of light dances over the trunks of the trees, the shadows stretching long across the ground. I walk in a slow, deliberate circle, trying to calm my nerves. That's when I see it. At first, it's just a flicker, something moving just at the edge of the light. I freeze. It's not an animal. It's too deliberate, too human. The figure is small, barely visible, but it's there. Just beyond the trees, just on the edge of the clearing, standing completely still. I blink and the figure is gone. I tell myself I imagined it, that it's just a trick of the light. But then, it happens again. This time, I see the movement more clearly. There's someone, standing there just out of reach of the light, barely visible in the darkness. It's too small to be a person, and the way it moves doesn't seem right. It's not walking, but swaying like it's dancing or rocking back and forth. The sight of it sends a shiver down my spine. I don't know what to do. My instincts tell me to run, to head back to the fire and not look back. But something keeps me rooted in place, as if I'm frozen by the strange, unsettling nature of the figure. I don't move for what feels like an eternity, just staring at the spot where I saw the movement. Finally, I turn and walk briskly back toward the campsite, not daring to look over my shoulder. I can feel my pulse pounding in my chest. My heart is racing, and the sudden realization that I might not be alone is almost suffocating. I reach the campsite and grab the axe I've left by the fire, holding it tightly in my hands. The figure, whatever it was, is gone, but I'm still not sure if I imagined it, if it was real. I sit back down near the fire, keeping my eyes on the trees at the edge of the clearing. The flames flicker and crackle, casting long shadows on the ground. I try to tell myself that it's just the isolation, that the woods are playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know what I saw, and the feeling of being watched only grows stronger. The rest of the night passes slowly. Every little sound makes me jump. Every crackle of the fire, every rustle in the trees, makes my heart skip a beat. I stay by the fire for hours, afraid to sleep, afraid to close my eyes. The tension in the air is suffocating, and I can't shake the feeling that something is waiting for me in the darkness, just beyond the firelight. When the first light of dawn finally breaks through the trees, I feel a sense of relief. The world around me is still, calm again. The birds begin to sing, the wind rustles the leaves, and the woods seem to come alive once more. I stand up, stretching my sore muscles, and pack up my things quickly. I don't look back as I leave the campsite behind. The unease, the fear, the feeling of being watched, they all fade away as I put more distance between myself and the clearing. The woods are beautiful, but I don't think I'll come back to this spot again. Not alone, at least. Whatever I saw last night, whatever I felt, will stay with me for a long time. But one thing is clear: the woods aren't always as peaceful as they seem, and sometimes it's better to leave the darkness behind. It had started out as an innocent weekend trip, just me and a couple of friends heading out into the woods to get away from the city for a few days. Nothing too crazy, just a campsite in a remote area we'd picked after a bit of research. It wasn't the first time we'd gone camping, but something about this trip felt different from the start. We arrived in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the treeline. The drive had been long, and the air had grown heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. The forest seemed so much denser than I remembered from the maps we'd looked at. Thick clusters of trees loomed over us, their trunks twisted and gnarled. It was quiet, a kind of silence you only get in places that are far from human reach. Setting up camp was straightforward. We pitched the tents, gathered firewood, and before long we had a campfire going. It crackled and popped, the flames dancing in the growing twilight. The warmth from the fire felt good, especially as the evening chill began to set in. We settled around it, casually chatting, sipping on some drinks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my mind wandering after the long drive. The fire felt comforting, and the sound of the crackling would give me something to focus on. The others didn't seem to notice anything strange. They were laughing, tossing small branches into the fire, and joking about whatever came to mind. But as the night deepened, I started to feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but there was a sense of unease in the air. It wasn't the kind of fear you get from imagining things. It was more like the feeling you get when you realize you've wandered too far from home and can't remember the way back. I glanced around, my eyes adjusting to the dark, but all I could see were the shadows of the trees stretching out in all directions. The campfire flickered and threw long, jagged shadows, making the trees look like towering, ominous figures. It felt like we were being watched, like something was out there, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Trying to shake off the feeling, I stood up and stretched, deciding to take a walk around the campsite. I figured some fresh air would clear my head. I told my friends I was going to check the area out for a bit, but no one seemed to care much. They were too caught up in their own conversations. I walked away from the fire and into the trees. The forest was dense, but the ground wasn't too uneven, and the path wasn't difficult to follow. The air felt cool on my skin, the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot the only sound. After a few minutes, I stopped and just listened. It was dead silent, the kind of silence that was almost too complete. Even the usual sounds of nighttime wildlife seemed absent. I had wandered a little farther than I intended, but something made me stay. The woods felt suffocating, like the trees were closing in on me. I turned to head back to camp, but as I looked over my shoulder, I saw something move in the distance. It was quick, almost imperceptible, just a brief flicker of motion between the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the way it moved, so fast, so fluid, didn't seem like anything I'd ever seen before. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, but whatever it was, it had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. My heart began to race, but I shrugged it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me in the dark. I turned back toward the campsite and began walking faster. The sooner I got back to the fire, the better. When I returned, the others were still sitting around the fire, just as I had left them. I didn't mention the weird feeling I had or the strange movement I'd seen in the woods. There was no reason to worry them over something I couldn't explain. But as I sat down by the fire, the unease still lingered. It felt like something was wrong, like the forest had grown hostile somehow. The night wore on, and the temperature dropped further. We all bundled up in jackets and blankets, huddling around the fire. The conversation died down as we all became a little more subdued, the chill in the air weighing on us. It was strange. Everything seemed to slow down, like time was stretching out. I remember glancing up at the sky, at the stars, which were so bright and clear it almost hurt to look at them. But then, as I looked back down toward the trees, I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. At first, I thought it was one of my friends. Maybe one of them had wandered off for a moment and returned. But then I realized it wasn't one of them. The figure was still unmoving. It was tall, but the silhouette was too vague, too hard to make out. It stood there, completely still, almost blending into the trees, but I could tell it wasn't part of the forest. A chill ran down my spine. I blinked, hoping my eyes were just playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, it was still there. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to acknowledge the campfire. It was just standing there. I don't know how long I stared at it. It felt like time had stopped, like the world was holding its breath. My heart was pounding in my chest, my body frozen in place, unable to look away. Finally, I forced myself to blink again, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. I didn't say anything to my friends. I wasn't sure what I had seen or if I had imagined it, but it didn't feel right. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, and I couldn't shake the thought that something or someone was out there, just beyond our little circle of light. We eventually settled down for the night, but sleep didn't come easy. The sounds of the forest seemed amplified in the silence. The wind rustled the leaves, branches creaked under the weight of the night air, and the occasional snap of a twig sent my heart leaping in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just spooked by the dark, but every little sound made me jump. At some point, I must have drifted off, but it wasn't long before I woke up again. It was still dark, but the campfire had burned down to just a few embers, casting a faint red glow across the clearing. The air was thick with tension, and the usual peaceful stillness of the forest had been replaced by a strange heaviness. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling sound. At first, it was distant, almost inaudible, but then it grew louder, closer. It was the unmistakable sound of something moving through the underbrush, and it was moving in our direction. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest. My friends were still asleep, oblivious, but I couldn't sleep anymore. The rustling continued, slow and deliberate, getting closer and closer to the edge of our camp. And then I saw it, the figure again. This time, it wasn't just standing still. It was moving, slowly, almost methodically, creeping between the trees. It was tall, but not quite human in the way it moved. The way its limbs extended, the way it bent unnaturally. It was wrong, something that shouldn't have been there. Panic surged through me. I wasn't imagining this. This thing was real, and it was coming closer. I wanted to scream, to wake my friends, but something in me told me that if I made any noise, if I drew attention to it, it would get closer. I held my breath, my body shaking, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. It didn't make a sound as it moved, its figure barely visible in the low light, but I could see enough to know it wasn't anything I wanted to encounter up close. The figure stopped just at the edge of the camp, standing perfectly still. It was like it was waiting for something, watching us, its presence heavy and suffocating. I don't know how long it stood there, but it felt like hours. My entire body was frozen, my heart hammering in my chest, and my mind was screaming at me to run, to do something. But I couldn't move, couldn't look away. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the woods, vanishing as quietly as it had appeared. For what felt like an eternity, I just sat there, staring at the empty spot where it had been. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, I gathered enough courage to wake up my friends. I told them everything, even though they didn't seem to believe me at first. They dismissed it as some wild animal or just a trick of the light. But I knew what I had seen. We packed up and left that morning, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I couldn't shake the image of that figure, its long, unnatural limbs and that eerie stillness. We made it out of the woods, but I'll never forget that night, and I don't think I'll ever go camping again. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just me and a couple of friends out in the woods for some camping, a little hiking, a little fishing, just enough to unwind from the noise of our daily lives. We picked a spot off the beaten path, far enough from the main trail so that we wouldn't be bothered by other campers, but close enough to the river that we could easily fish and cool off in the water. The plan was to set up camp, have some meals by the fire, and enjoy the peace. It was supposed to be just another weekend like any other. We parked the truck at the trailhead and grabbed our gear. Tents, sleeping bags, coolers, fishing poles, stuff we'd done 100 times before. The hike in was easy, no more than a couple of miles, mostly downhill. We joked around, laughing at how ridiculous it was that we were carrying so much gear for just 2 nights in the woods. We made it to the spot we wanted to camp in the late afternoon, the sun still high in the sky. We found a nice flat area near the river, perfect for the tent and campfire. We set up camp quickly. The tent went up first, then the fire pit. We had planned to fish and cook the first night's dinner by the river, but we had forgotten the bait. So we made do with some snacks and a couple of beers. As the sun started to set, we gathered wood for the fire. The shadows grew longer, and the woods began to take on a different feel. The air cooled off, the quiet deepened, and the sounds of the animals around us seemed to grow louder as night settled in. The fire crackled, and we sat around it, talking about old times, catching up on things that we hadn't talked about in years. It was during that night, as we sat around the fire, that something felt off. First, I brushed it off. I figured it was just my imagination, or maybe the woods playing tricks on me. There were always weird little sounds when you were out in the woods. Branches creaking, the wind rustling through the leaves, the occasional snap of something in the distance. But the longer I sat there, the more unsettled I felt. I couldn't put my finger on it. It was just a feeling. I started scanning the area around us. The darkness was thick, but the firelight cast long, flickering shadows, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving at the edge of the trees. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to calm myself. It was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, something about the way it moved made me uneasy. It was almost too deliberate, too quiet. I told myself I was being paranoid. "Everything good?" One of my friends, Ben, asked, looking up from his phone. He must have seen my eyes darting around. "Yeah, just thought I saw something," I said, trying to play it cool. Ben didn't seem concerned. He took a swig of his beer and went back to scrolling through his phone. I forced myself to relax, but the feeling stayed. There was a pressure in the air, a sense that we were being watched. It was subtle at first, like a little itch on the back of my neck that I couldn't scratch. We went to bed a couple of hours later. It wasn't that late, but we were all tired, and the fire had burned low. I crawled into the tent, pulled the zipper closed, and tried to settle into my sleeping bag. The ground was hard, and the air was chilly, but I didn't mind. I figured I'd fall asleep soon enough, but it wasn't that simple. The noises outside started again, louder this time. A snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves. I could hear something moving, something big enough to make a noise. It wasn't a squirrel or a bird. It was something heavier, something deliberate. I stiffened, listening closely. My friends were already snoring, deep in their own world of sleep. I lay there, staring up at the dark ceiling of the tent, my mind racing. There was no way it was a deer. It sounded too close, and the movements were too intentional. I waited for what felt like forever, straining to hear anything more. Then there it was again, a low, almost imperceptible shuffle, followed by a breathy exhale, like someone was trying to be quiet but couldn't quite manage it. I held my breath. The next noise was unmistakable, a footstep, clear and sharp in the quiet of the night. I could almost feel it under me, like the earth vibrating with the impact. It was close, too close. My heart started to race, and the feeling in the pit of my stomach tightened. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I wasn't alone out here, not in the way I thought I was. I waited, hoping it was just some animal, maybe a bear or a wild boar, but I didn't hear any more rustling leaves or animal sounds. No more birds, no more crickets. The forest had fallen silent. My breathing was loud in my ears. Every muscle in my body was tense, and my mind was spinning, trying to figure out what to do. The footsteps came again, closer. I shot up in my sleeping bag, my pulse pounding in my throat. The tent was small, and the door was just a thin zipper. There was no way I could reach for my flashlight without making noise. I had to do something, but my mind was frozen, my body stiff with fear. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. But I knew that wasn't the case. There was something out there, something that was not supposed to be there. I reached over and shook Ben, trying to be as quiet as possible. But he was deep in sleep, his body limp and unresponsive. My other friends were the same. They were all out cold, oblivious to whatever was happening outside. It was just me and whatever was moving out there in the dark. Another step. This time, I heard the crunch of the earth, like someone was standing on the edge of the camp, just out of sight. My heart slammed in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I could call out, but I was terrified that whatever was out there would hear me and come closer. Or maybe it already knew I was awake. I thought about waking everyone up, but what if it wasn't an animal? What if it was someone else? What if they weren't alone? I grabbed my phone, hoping the light from the screen might make me feel better, but the battery was almost dead. I cursed under my breath and shoved it back into my pocket. I needed to act, but what could I do? I couldn't just sit here. The footsteps came closer again, slow and steady, until they were right by the tent. I could hear the soft shuffle of fabric against skin, the rustling of someone, moving just outside the entrance. It was too close now. I couldn't pretend I didn't hear it. It wasn't an animal. Not anymore. I reached for the zipper of the tent. My hand was trembling, and my mind was racing. Should I just open it and face whatever was out there? Or should I wait, hoping it would leave? I didn't know, but my gut was telling me to get out of there. I slowly, carefully, unzipped the tent. My heart was hammering in my chest. I held my breath, waiting for any sign, any sound. Nothing. I slowly pushed the tent flap open, just a crack. And there, standing in the shadow of the trees, was a figure. Person. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothing, almost blending in with the night itself. I couldn't see their face, just the silhouette. My stomach dropped. They didn't move, not at first. I couldn't tell if they were watching me or waiting for something, but they were there, and they had been there for who knows how long. I wasn't sure if I should make a move or just stay perfectly still. Then the figure took a step back and disappeared into the trees. No sound, no rustling, just gone. I waited a long time, frozen in the tent. My mind was a jumble of thoughts, and I was shaking all over. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't staying out here another night. Couldn't. I woke everyone up after what felt like an eternity. They were groggy and confused, but when I explained what had happened, they didn't question me. We packed up our things in a hurry, not caring about the mess we left behind. We didn't stop until we were back at the trailhead, far away from that place. We didn't talk about it on the way out, and when we got back to the truck, none of us said a word. I think we all knew that something wasn't right. We had been watched, and whatever it wasn't an animal. It wasn't a bear or a boar. It was something else. That was the last time I went camping in the woods like that. I still go out on hikes, but I stay on the main trails now where people are around. I don't know who that figure was or what they wanted, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of knowing that I wasn't alone. I was excited about this camping trip. It wasn't my first time in the woods, but it had been a while since I'd last gone. The thought of getting out of the city, away from all the noise, the lights, and the constant buzzing of daily life, felt like the perfect way to clear my head. I had planned the trip for a few weeks, choosing a remote spot by a quiet stream far off the beaten path. I packed up my tent, a small backpack of supplies, and a sleeping bag, thinking that a couple of days in the wild would be just what I needed to relax. I headed out alone. I didn't mind being by myself. Actually, I preferred it. I liked the solitude. It gave me time to think, reflect, and just enjoy the peace that only nature could offer. The drive out was smooth, with the road eventually turning into a dirt path. After about an hour of bumping along, I reached the spot I had chosen, parked my car, and started to unload. The sun was already dipping behind the trees when I set up camp. I worked quickly, staking the tent into the soft ground by the stream. The sound of the water gently flowing was soothing, and the smell of pine filled the air. As nightfall came, the woods around me seemed to close in, casting long shadows between the trunks. I built a small fire and sat down near it, pulling out some snacks and a drink. The fire crackled, and the warmth felt good against the chill in the air. I could hear the occasional rustle in the leaves, the calls of birds or distant animals, but overall, it was peaceful. As darkness settled, I found myself gazing into the flames. My thoughts wandered. I tried not to focus too much on the isolation of it all. Being alone in the woods like this was normal, right? I had done it before. Yet, there was something off about this trip. Maybe it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. I had never camped here before, and I didn't know much about the area. I checked my watch. It was getting late. I had planned on going to bed early, but something made me hesitate. I felt the urge to step away from the fire for a moment, so I walked a few feet into the woods, just to stretch my legs. I stayed close to the camp, not wanting to wander too far. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and the forest seemed to be holding its breath. I couldn't help but feel that someone, or something, was watching me. I turned around, scanning the trees, but nothing moved. The wind had died down, and the woods were eerily silent. I shrugged it off, blaming the quiet for playing tricks on me. I returned to the fire and sat down again, though my sense of unease didn't completely go away. The night stretched on. I added more wood to the fire and settled into my sleeping bag by the warmth, my eyes beginning to grow heavy. At some point, I drifted into a light sleep. The crackling of the fire and the sounds of the forest blended together into a quiet hum. But then, I was awakened by a noise. It was faint at first, like something brushing against the leaves or stepping through the undergrowth. I sat up, straining to listen. The noise came again, this time louder. It was coming from the trees, not far from my camp. My heart began to beat faster. I stood up, trying to remain calm. I knew that animals roamed these woods, but this didn't feel like the usual rustling of small creatures. The noise was deliberate, almost as if someone, or something, was moving carefully through the woods, trying to stay hidden. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. My eyes darted around, scanning the trees. There was nothing, no sign of movement, no shadow slipping between the trunks. I exhaled, embarrassed by my jumpiness. It had to be an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. It's nothing. But the feeling in my gut didn't go away. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I forced myself to sit back down by the fire, telling myself I was overreacting. It was late and I was just tired. I needed sleep. I stayed awake for a while longer, staring into the fire, but eventually, sleep claimed me again. This time, though, I didn't rest as peacefully as before. I kept tossing and turning, each time waking up to the unsettling silence of the woods around me. Every rustle of the leaves or crack of a twig made me jump. At some point in the night, I heard it again. The sound, closer this time. It wasn't just a random rustle. It was a steady, deliberate movement through the forest, like footsteps, slow and cautious. I froze, my blood running cold. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, ragged, almost as if it was trying to be quiet. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source. It was right behind me. I whipped my head around, shining the flashlight in all directions. The beam flickered, then caught something, a shadow moving between the trees. It wasn't an animal. The figure was too large, too human. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew someone was out there. My pulse pounded in my ears. The figure was still. I waited, my breath catching in my throat. Then, without warning, it darted deeper into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there for a moment, frozen in shock. Should I follow? Should I call for help? But there was no one out here. I was completely alone. The thought of going after it, whatever it was, terrified me. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be another camper? Someone lost? Or was it something else? I waited for what felt like an eternity, staring into the blackness, hoping to hear something that would make sense of what I'd just seen. But there was nothing. No sound. No movement. Eventually, I stood up, my legs shaky. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight, determined to leave. Whatever it was, I didn't want to find out. I was done. I wasn't sticking around to see what else might happen. I took a few steps toward the road where I had parked my car, but then I stopped. The sound of footsteps, slow and measured, echoed through the trees behind me. I turned around, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure was there again, standing just at the edge of the trees, watching me. My flashlight flickered weakly, casting a pale glow on the figure. I couldn't make out any features, but I felt its eyes on me. It was almost like it was waiting for something, waiting for me to make a move. Panic surged in my chest. I started walking, then breaking into a run, heading straight for my car. My mind was racing, but I couldn't think clearly. All I could focus on was the sound of those footsteps following me, step by step, as if it were right behind me. I reached my car in a matter of seconds, throwing open the door and jumping inside. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, starting the engine. The headlights illuminated the dark road ahead, but I didn't look back. I didn't dare to. I sped down the dirt path, the car bouncing along the uneven ground. My heart still thudded in my chest as I drove faster and faster, not stopping until I reached the main road. Only then did I finally slow down, my breathing ragged and uneven. I glanced in the rearview mirror. There was no one there. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, not daring to stop. The woods, the figure, the footsteps. It all felt so surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't shake. I couldn't explain what had happened. I didn't want to. When I finally got home, I sat in my car for a long time, just staring at the house. The unease still lingered in my chest, gnawing at me. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something had been out there, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. That night, I didn't sleep, and the next morning, I didn't even bother to check my phone or look up directions to the campsite. I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going back. I never went camping alone again. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway. Just me, my tent, and the woods. Nothing big, just a short break to get away from everything. I had packed light. A small backpack with a few essentials, some food, a flashlight, and a blanket for the cold nights. I'd always enjoyed camping, and this spot was one I'd been to before. A remote little place tucked in the backwoods where the trails were quiet, and there wasn't another soul for miles. The perfect spot for solitude. When I arrived, the sun was just beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the dirt path. The air was cool but not cold, and the leaves rustled in the breeze. There's something calming about the woods at that hour, the soft chirping of crickets and the occasional distant call of a bird. I had always found peace in nature, so I started setting up my tent right away. I wasn't in a hurry, but the fading light reminded me I didn't want to be caught in the dark with no shelter. I pitched my tent without much trouble, enjoying the process, the way the fabric stretched over the poles, the satisfying sound of the stakes going into the ground. Once it was up, I gathered some dry wood to start a small fire. A campfire was always comforting, especially when you're alone. It wasn't too chilly yet, but it would get colder once the sun was gone completely. The fire crackled to life with the first strike of the match, and soon I had a small flame flickering in front of me. Sitting back on a fallen log, I watched the flames dance. The smell of burning wood mixed with the fresh, earthy scent of the forest. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and took a deep breath. Everything felt right. I had been living in the city for so long, and I had forgotten how soothing it could be to just sit, listen to the sounds of nature, and not have to think about anything else. The fire was the only light for miles. The night crept in slowly, and with it, the temperature dropped. I pulled out a small book and began to read, the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling in the trees providing a backdrop to the quiet. But after a while, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. First, I tried to ignore it. I had been in the woods many times before, and the sounds of the forest were nothing new. But this was different. There was something distant, like a presence just beyond my line of sight. Every time I looked around, the woods seemed deeper, the shadows darker. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me, so I forced myself to focus on my book. But the feeling didn't go away. It was subtle at first, just the sound of something faint like footsteps in the underbrush, far off, but not far enough to be animals. Something heavier, human-like. I told myself it was probably just a deer, or maybe a larger animal wandering through. The forest had plenty of wildlife, after all. But still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling persisted. There was something out there. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew it. I stood up and threw another log on the fire, hoping the extra light and heat would ease the creeping anxiety. The flames snapped and popped, and for a moment it seemed to help. But then, just as I was about to sit back down, I heard it. A snap. A branch breaking under the weight of something heavy. I froze. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight, but I didn't want to make a sound. I slowly crouched down beside the fire, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the circle of light. My breath caught in my throat, and I held still, waiting. The silence was suffocating, but only for a moment. Then I heard it again, louder this time. A footstep, then another. Someone was definitely out there, moving slowly, deliberately. I didn't move. My pulse was racing, my skin cold with fear. I didn't know what to do. Should I call out? Should I run? But where would I go? I was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road. It would be dark soon, and I'd be completely exposed. I stayed low, hoping whoever or whatever it was would leave me alone. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer, and I realized then that they weren't following a natural rhythm. They weren't the random steps of an animal. They were deliberate, like a person trying to be quiet, trying to sneak up on me. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I had to do something, anything. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, aiming the beam into the darkness where I had heard the steps. It cut through the trees, briefly illuminating the underbrush and the thick shadows beyond. But there was nothing there, no movement, no sign of anyone. I tried to calm my breathing, trying to make sense of what was happening. But every time I relaxed even slightly, the steps returned. Closer now. I could hear the crunch of dirt and leaves beneath the weight of boots. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but I couldn't seem to get my thoughts straight. I had no phone signal, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. If something had gone wrong, I was alone out here. The fire flickered as the wind picked up, sending a shiver through me. I had never felt so exposed before, so vulnerable. Whoever or whatever was out there, I could feel them watching me, waiting. Then, in the distance, I heard something new. A faint whisper, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. It was strange, disjointed, like a murmur carried by the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely there, as clear as the sound of footsteps. I stood frozen, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The whisper came again, this time closer. My stomach dropped, and every part of me screamed to run. But where could I go? The woods stretched endlessly in all directions. The path I had come in on was too far away to reach in time, and the dark night made everything seem impossible to navigate. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. The whispering ceased. The only sound was the fire, crackling softly in the night. I stayed there for what felt like hours, not daring to move, listening for any sign of life. My heart was still pounding in my chest, but eventually, the silence became too much. My mind raced, searching for explanations, but none seemed to make sense. I hadn't seen anything, no person, no animal, nothing. Yet, I knew something had been there, just beyond the firelight. Finally, I gathered the courage to grab my things and crawl into my tent. I locked the flap, securing myself inside, and tried to calm my mind. The fire outside cast flickering shadows on the tent walls, and the wind rustled the trees. I lay there, wide awake, unable to sleep, staring at the dim glow of the fire through the fabric. I never figured out what happened that night. There was no sign of anyone in the morning. No tracks in the dirt, no disturbances. It was as if whoever or whatever it was had never been there at all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. I left early that morning. I didn't bother to pack up the tent or gather my things neatly. I just grabbed what I could and hiked back to my car. The woods felt different on my way out. Empty, almost lifeless. And I never went back. It wasn't until years later that I learned about a string of disappearances in the area. People who had vanished without a trace, deep in the same woods where I had camped. I don't know if that was related to what happened to me, but I never doubted what I felt that night. Sometimes the woods are more than just trees and trails, and sometimes you don't want to know what's lurking just beyond the light. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Just me, the woods, and the quiet solitude I was craving. I needed to disconnect, to get away from the noise of the city, the constant ringing of notifications, and the endless pull of responsibilities. A weekend alone in nature seemed like the perfect way to reset. I had everything packed: the tent, the sleeping bag, some cans of beans, and my trusty old camping stove. My phone was left behind purposefully. I wasn't going to need it. I drove up to the campsite early Friday evening. The sky was still bright, the sun dipping just enough to create a cool breeze that rustled the leaves. The air smelled fresh, like pine and earth. I parked the car near the trailhead and grabbed my gear, beginning the short hike into the woods to my designated camping area. The spot I picked was secluded, off the main trail, with a small creek nearby and a good clearing for the tent. I liked it because I knew it would be quiet. No one would be walking by and I wouldn't be bothered. It felt like the perfect spot to get away from it all. Setting up camp was easy. I unfurled the tent, laid out the tarp, and hammered in the stakes. The fire pit was a little overgrown, but I cleaned it up, collecting dry wood and starting a fire. The sun was low now, and the fire crackled softly, casting long shadows in the fading light. I sat by the fire for a while, watching the orange flames dance, warming my hands. It wasn't until later, when the darkness fully settled in, that I noticed the first strange thing. At first, it was just a faint noise, a rustling coming from the woods to my left. I figured it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or deer, something harmless. But the longer I listened, the more it felt like the sound was deliberate, like something was moving around in a pattern. I shook it off. After all, I was in the woods. Animals made noises. It was nothing. But then there was a snap of a twig, sharp and close. I froze. I hadn't heard anything approach. The fire flickered, casting strange shadows across the trees. I leaned forward, peering into the darkness, trying to see if there was something, or someone, moving just beyond the firelight. I heard it again, a low, purposeful rustling. I stood up, slowly, my hand reaching for the flashlight I kept in my bag. The beam cut through the darkness, moving over the underbrush, illuminating nothing but trees and rocks. I scanned the area, heart pounding now. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just my nerves. Maybe a branch had fallen or an animal had moved in the undergrowth. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I shrugged it off as paranoia and went back to the fire, poking it with a stick. The warmth was comforting. The crackling of the fire was soothing, and slowly, the tension in my shoulders loosened. But the feeling didn't go away. Hours passed, and I sat there, alone in the dark with only the fire to keep me company. My mind kept drifting back to the sounds I'd heard. What if it wasn't just an animal? What if it was someone? A person out here in the middle of nowhere? It didn't make sense, though. Who would be out this far, especially this late? I kept telling myself it was nothing. Just the wind, maybe, or a bear. But the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. If it was a bear, it wouldn't be making those specific, deliberate sounds. And if it was a person, well, I didn't want to think about that. The fire was beginning to die down when I heard something else. A voice. It was so faint at first, I thought it was just the wind again. But no, it wasn't the wind. It was a voice, low, too far away to make out the words. My body tensed, and I instinctively grabbed the flashlight again, shining it around in a circle, the beam cutting through the night. Nothing. The woods were silent now, almost too silent. I sat still for a long time, listening, waiting for the voice again. But there was only the sound of the fire crackling and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Eventually, I decided to go to bed. I zipped myself into the tent and lay there, staring up at the canvas ceiling. The woods felt too quiet now, too still. It wasn't just the lack of noise, it was the absence of everything. No animals, no wind, no insects, just silence. And in that silence, every little noise seemed amplified. The crack of a twig in the distance, the rustle of leaves, my own breathing. It all felt too loud. I must have eventually drifted off because the next thing I knew, I was awake. The moon was high in the sky, casting a pale light into the tent. I heard it again, an unmistakable noise. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking just outside the tent. I held my breath, straining to listen. It wasn't an animal this time. It was human. There was no mistaking it. The footsteps were too regular, too paced. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. I wanted to get up, to do something, but my body wouldn't move. I kept my eyes on the entrance of the tent, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The footsteps continued for what felt like an eternity, each step dragging on in the cold night air. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Couldn't. My mind was racing, my thoughts a blur. What was going on? Who was out there? I lay there, motionless, until the first light of dawn began to creep in through the trees. Only then did I dare move, slowly unzipping the tent and peering outside. There was nothing. No sign of anyone, no footprints, nothing that would suggest someone had been there. I don't know what happened that night. I didn't hear anything else after that, and the rest of the weekend passed without incident. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. The unease followed me, even as I packed up and left the campsite. I'll never forget the footsteps in the night, the feeling of being surrounded by something I couldn't see. It stayed with me long after I returned to the city, long after the trip was over. It was a reminder that sometimes the woods are more than just a peaceful escape. Sometimes they hold something else, something that doesn't want you there. But I'll never know for sure, and maybe that's the scariest part.